Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the misty beginnings of Anglo-Saxon England, exploring the legendary figure of Hengist, the Saxon warrior who would become the founder of the Kingdom of Kent. We'll softly explore the transformation of post-Roman Britain, from the withdrawal of Roman legions around 410 CE, to the arrival of Germanic tribes in the mid-5th century, and finally to the establishment of the first stable Anglo-Saxon kingdom in southeastern England, all while the ancient world slowly gave way to the medieval. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Don't be shy. Share what draws you to early English history, or which Anglo-Saxon kingdom you'd like to explore next. Your thoughts always warm my heart. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the 5th century lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Hengist, later known as the founder of the Kingdom of Kent, enters our story during one of the most turbulent periods in British history. The year was approximately 449 CE, though the exact date remains shrouded in the mists of time, much like the foggy marshlands of the Thames estuary, where his ships first touched British shores. The Roman Empire, that great colossus which had dominated Europe for centuries, was slowly crumbling at its edges. The legions that had protected Britain for nearly 400 years were being recalled to defend Rome itself against barbarian invasions. As the last Roman soldiers departed from Dover's White Cliffs in 410 CE, they left behind a province that had become thoroughly Romanized. Cities with forums and bathhouses, straight roads connecting tribal capitals, and a population that had grown accustomed to imperial protection. Yet in their absence, Britain did not simply revert to its pre-Roman Celtic ways. Instead, it entered a twilight period of sub-Roman rule, where local British kings and warlords attempted to maintain order using Roman methods and titles. These rulers faced challenges from every direction: Pictish raiders from Scotland, Irish pirates from the west, and an increasingly restless population struggling with economic collapse as Roman trade networks dissolved. Into this world of uncertainty came Hengist and his brother Horsa, whose very names, meaning stallion and horse respectively, would echo through centuries of English folklore. They arrived not as conquerors initially, but as invited guests, hired swords in the service of a British king named Vortigern, whose own authority was questioned and whose realm was beset by enemies. The brothers' ship, a sturdy oak vessel with a curved prow and square sail, approached the shores of the Isle of Thanet on a grey morning when the mist clung to the water like spirits of the ancient past. The rhythmic splash of oars and the creaking of wood marked their arrival at what would become known as Ebbsfleet, a name that would forever be associated with the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon Age in Britain. Hengist stood at the prow of his vessel, his weathered face scanning the coastline. He was a man in the prime of life, perhaps 35 years old, with the bearing of one accustomed to command. His fair hair was braided in the Germanic fashion, and his blue eyes held the calculating gaze of a warrior who had learned to read both battlefield and political situation with equal skill. Around his neck hung a golden torque, marking his status as a nobleman among his people, while at his side rested a pattern-welded sword, whose blade had been folded and refolded until it possessed an almost mystical strength. Beside him stood Horsa, younger by perhaps 3 years, but no less formidable. Where Hengist possessed the thoughtful demeanour of a strategist, Horsa carried himself with the eager energy of a born warrior. His laughter came easily, and his loyalty to his brother was absolute. Together, they had led their men across the grey waters of the North Sea, following ravens and stars, guided by rumours of opportunity in the wealthy lands beyond the horizon. Their followers numbered perhaps 200 warriors, men drawn from the tribes along the continental coast, Angles from the marshy lands of modern Denmark, Saxons from the river valleys of northern Germany, and Jutes from the peninsula that bore their name. These were not desperate refugees fleeing famine or disaster, but ambitious warriors seeking their fortunes in a land where Roman order was breaking down, and opportunities existed for those bold enough to seize them. As their ships grounded on the pebbled beach of Thanet, the brothers and their men encountered their first Britons. These were not the fierce Celtic warriors of ancient tales, but men who still dressed in Roman-style tunics and spoke Latin alongside their native tongue. They carried messages from Vortigern, welcoming the Germanic newcomers and explaining the terms of their service. The agreement seemed straightforward enough. Vortigern would provide the Saxons with food, shelter, and payment in exchange for their military service against his enemies, particularly the Picts, who regularly raided from the north. The brothers would establish their base on Thanet, an island separated from the mainland by the narrow Wonsum Channel, providing them with security while keeping them somewhat apart from the main British population. Yet, even in these early negotiations, the seeds of future conflict were being sown. Hengist, with his keen political instincts, quickly grasped that Vortigern's position was far from secure. The British king faced opposition, not only from external enemies, but from rival claimants within his own realm. This understanding would prove crucial as events unfolded, for it meant that the Saxon leader was dealing not with a unified Roman-style state, but with a fragmented collection of competing authorities. The initial campaign against the Picts proved the worth of the Saxon warriors. Unlike the Britons, who still fought in the Roman manner with organized infantry units, the Saxons employed the fierce individual combat style of their ancestors. Each warrior was a hero in his own right, trained from childhood in swordplay and spear work, bound to his lord by sacred oaths that transcended mere monetary payment. Their battle cries echoed across the northern moors as they struck deep into Pictish territory, achieving victories that had eluded British forces for years. Horsa particularly distinguished himself in these campaigns. Contemporary accounts, though filtered through centuries of retelling, speak of his prowess with sword and axe, his ability to inspire men in the heat of battle, and his generous distribution of treasure to his followers. He embodied the Germanic ideal of the warrior hero, fighting not merely for pay, but for the intangible rewards of fame and honour that would ensure his name lived on in the songs of his people. Hengist, meanwhile, focused on the broader strategic picture. He established diplomatic contacts with other Germanic groups along the continental coast, sending messages that spoke of opportunities in Britain for those with the courage to seize them. He also began to study British society more closely, learning the language, understanding the complex relationships between different tribal groups, and identifying the sources of Vortigern's weakness. The success of the Saxon warriors led to an expansion of their role. Vortigern, pleased with their effectiveness against the Picts, began to employ them against other enemies as well. When Irish raiders struck the western coasts, Saxon ships pursued them back across the sea. When rival British kingdoms threatened Vortigern's borders, Saxon warriors marched to defend them. Each victory enhanced the reputation of Hengist and Horsa, while also increasing their understanding of British geography and politics. As months turned to years, the Saxon settlement on Thanet began to take on a more permanent character. What had initially been a military camp evolved into something resembling a small town. Warriors brought their families across from the continent, craftsmen established workshops, and merchants began trading with both British and continental markets. The Wonsum Channel, which had once seemed like a barrier, became a highway for Saxon ships travelling back and forth between Britain and their homeland. This growing Saxon presence did not go unnoticed by the British population. In the markets of Canterbury and London, people spoke nervously of the increasing numbers of Germanic settlers. Some British nobles began to question Vortigern's wisdom in hiring such powerful and numerous mercenaries. Others worried about the cultural and religious implications of having pagan warriors established so close to the Christianized British population. These concerns reached their peak when Vortigern made a decision that would alter the course of British history. According to tradition, Hengist arranged for his daughter to meet the British king at a diplomatic feast. The young woman, whose name is recorded as Rowena in later sources, was said to possess extraordinary beauty and charm. Whether through genuine attraction or calculated political maneuvering, or perhaps both, Vortigern became infatuated with her and sought her hand in marriage. The marriage negotiations provided Hengist with the opportunity he had been waiting for. In exchange for his daughter's hand, he requested not more gold or provisions, but something far more valuable: land. Specifically, he asked for the grant of the entire Kingdom of Kent, the southeastern region of Britain that included the wealthy city of Canterbury and controlled the shortest crossing to the continent. Vortigern's agreement to this demand marked the beginning of the end of his alliance with the Saxons and the start of Saxon territorial expansion in Britain. The grant of Kent to Hengist was seen by many Britons as an unacceptable surrender of sovereignty to foreign mercenaries. Opposition to Vortigern's rule began to coalesce around his own son, Vortimer, who gathered a coalition of British nobles determined to drive the Saxons from their shores. The transformation of the Saxons from invited mercenaries to territorial rivals created tensions that could not be resolved through diplomacy. Both sides began to prepare for the possibility of open warfare. Hengist used his new position as de facto ruler of Kent to invite more of his kinsmen from the continent, while British forces under Vortimer began to mobilize for what they saw as a war of liberation. The landscape of southeastern Britain during this period would have been dramatically different from what we see today. The Weald, the great forest that covered much of Kent and Sussex, stretched unbroken for miles, providing refuge for bands of warriors and making military movements difficult to track. The Thames estuary was broader and shallower, with numerous islands and channels that could hide ships or provide defensible positions. Roman roads still connected the major settlements, but many had fallen into disrepair without imperial maintenance. Into this setting, Hengist brought not just military force, but also a different way of organizing society. Saxon culture was fundamentally different from the Romanized British civilization it encountered. Where the Britons still maintained something resembling Roman administrative structures, the Saxons organized themselves around personal loyalty to war leaders. Where British Christianity had begun to take root among the urban populations, Saxon paganism honored gods of war and wisdom, sky and earth. The religious dimension of the conflict added another layer of complexity to the unfolding drama. Hengist and his followers worshipped Woden, the one-eyed god of warriors and poets, along with Thuna, the thunder god, and Frigg, the goddess of love and fertility. Their arrival brought not just political change, but also a revival of Germanic paganism in a land that was slowly becoming Christian. British bishops and monks viewed the Saxon presence with alarm. Seeing it not merely as a political threat, but as a spiritual one. The presence of pagan temples and the practice of pagan rituals in Kent represented a direct challenge to the Christian identity that British elites were trying to establish. This religious tension would persist for generations, influencing the eventual conversion of the Saxon kingdoms to Christianity in the following century. As we follow Hengist's story through these early years of his presence in Britain, we see a man who was simultaneously a product of his time and an agent of change. He embodied the Germanic tradition of the warrior king, the leader who ruled through personal charisma and battlefield success, rather than inherited authority or bureaucratic position. Yet he also demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt to new circumstances, learning to navigate the complex political landscape of post-Roman Britain, while never losing sight of his ultimate goal, the establishment of a secure and prosperous realm for his people. The stage was now set for the dramatic events that would transform Hengist from a hired mercenary into the founder of a kingdom. The marriage alliance with Vortigern had given him a foothold in Kent, but that foothold would need to be defended against British resistance and expanded through further conquest. The brothers who had arrived as servants would soon become masters, but the cost of that transformation would be measured in blood and betrayal. To understand the magnitude of Hengist's achievement in establishing the Kingdom of Kent, we must first immerse ourselves in the strange and shifting world of 5th century Britain. This was a land caught between two ages, where the certainties of Roman rule had crumbled, but the new order that would replace them had not yet taken shape. The Britain that Hengist encountered was far from the primitive Celtic society that had existed before the Roman conquest 4 centuries earlier. Generations of Roman rule had transformed the island into a thoroughly civilized province of the empire. Cities like London, York, and Canterbury boasted all the amenities of Roman urban life: public baths, amphitheatres, forums for commerce and governance, and comfortable villas for the wealthy equipped with hypocaust heating systems and elaborate mosaic floors. The Roman road network connected these urban centres in an efficient web of communication and trade. Watling Street ran from Dover through Canterbury and London to Chester and beyond. Ermine Street connected London with York via Lincoln. The Fosse Way linked Exeter with Lincoln, creating a strategic frontier line across the middle of England. These roads, built to Roman engineering standards with deep foundations and carefully graded surfaces, remained passable long after the legions had departed. Yet by 449 CE, when Hengist first set foot on British soil, this Roman world was already beginning to fray at the edges. Without imperial administrators to maintain them, public buildings fell into disrepair. The complex supply chains that had brought Mediterranean luxuries to British markets were disrupted by barbarian invasions on the continent. Most critically, the monetary economy that had underpinned Roman commerce was breaking down as silver coins became scarce, and barter arrangements replaced cash transactions. Into this economic vacuum stepped local strongmen, who attempted to maintain order through personal military power rather than imperial authority. These were the men that later sources would call tyrants, not in the modern sense of cruel dictators, but in the classical meaning of rulers who held power without legitimate authority. Vortigern was the most successful of these figures, carving out a realm that encompassed much of what would later become Wales and Western England. Vortigern's court would have presented a fascinating mixture of Roman and Celtic elements. Latin remained the language of administration and high culture, while British Celtic dialects persisted among the common people. Christian bishops, trained in Roman theological traditions, served alongside Druids who maintained older Celtic religious practices. Roman-style bureaucrats worked to collect taxes and maintain records, while Celtic warriors provided military service in exchange for land grants and treasure distribution. The military situation facing Vortigern was complex and dangerous. To the north, the Picts of Scotland had never been fully subdued by Rome and saw the withdrawal of the legions as an opportunity to raid deep into British territory. These painted warriors, skilled in guerrilla tactics and intimately familiar with the Highland terrain, could strike quickly and disappear before British forces could respond effectively. From the west came Irish raiders, whom the Romans had called Scotti. These sea-born warriors possessed fast, maneuverable boats that could beach on any suitable shore and return to the sea before land-based defenders could organize resistance. They sought not conquest, but plunder. Slaves, cattle, precious metals, and any other portable wealth they could carry back to Ireland. Perhaps most dangerously, Vortigern faced internal challenges from rival British rulers who questioned his authority and sought to establish their own independent kingdoms. The concept of a unified British resistance to foreign invasion, so popular in later Romantic literature, had little basis in 5th century reality. British rulers were often more concerned with fighting each other than with presenting a united front against external enemies. It was in this context that Vortigern's decision to hire Saxon mercenaries made strategic sense. Germanic warriors had served in the Roman army for generations, often proving themselves among the most effective soldiers in imperial service. Their fighting style, emphasizing individual prowess and personal loyalty, made them ideal for the kind of small-scale mobile warfare that characterized post-Roman Britain. The initial Saxon settlement on the Isle of Thanet was carefully chosen for its strategic advantages. Thanet was technically an island, separated from the mainland of Kent by the Wonsum Channel, a waterway that was significantly wider and deeper in the 5th century than it is today. This geographical separation provided security for the Saxon base, while allowing easy access to both the British mainland and the continental homelands across the North Sea. The channel itself served as a natural harbour for Saxon ships, protecting them from storms while allowing rapid deployment against enemies. From Thanet, Saxon war bands could reach any threatened point in Kent within a day's march, while also being able to intercept sea-borne raiders attempting to penetrate the Thames estuary. The location demonstrated Hengist's sophisticated understanding of military geography and his ability to think strategically about long-term positioning. The landscape of Kent itself offered both opportunities and challenges for Saxon settlement. The county's position in southeastern Britain made it the natural gateway for continental trade and communication. The Kentish Downs provided excellent grazing for livestock, while the Thames Valley offered fertile agricultural land. The Great Forest of Anderida, covering much of the Weald, supplied timber for construction and fuel, while also harbouring game for hunting. Yet this same geography that made Kent attractive also made it vulnerable. The county's extensive coastline provided numerous landing points for hostile fleets, while the Thames offered a highway deep into the British heartland for any enemy force that could gain control of its waters. Effective defence of Kent required not just static fortifications, but also mobile forces capable of rapid response to threats from multiple directions. The existing population of Kent, when Hengist arrived, was a mixture of Celtic Britons and earlier Germanic settlers. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Germanic peoples had been settling in eastern Britain even before the official end of Roman rule, possibly as agricultural workers or craftsmen rather than warriors. These earlier settlers would have provided valuable local knowledge to Hengist's forces while also serving as potential recruits for his expanding warband. The religious landscape of 5th century Kent was equally complex. Christianity had made significant inroads among the urban populations, and British nobility, but pagan beliefs persisted, especially in rural areas. Roman temples dedicated to classical gods like Jupiter and Mars coexisted with Celtic shrines honoring local deities. Into this religious mixture, Hengist brought the Germanic pantheon headed by Woden, creating a theological as well as political challenge to British Christian identity. Trade relationships in post-Roman Britain reflected the broader economic disruption affecting the former empire. The complex commercial networks that had brought African olive oil, Spanish silver, and Gaulish pottery to British markets had largely collapsed. In their place, a more localized economy emerged, based on regional production and shorter distance trade relationships. This economic localization actually benefited Germanic settlers like Hengist's followers, whose traditional economy had always been more self-sufficient than the highly specialized Roman system. Saxon craftsmen could produce their own weapons, tools, and household goods without relying on distant suppliers. Saxon farmers practiced mixed agriculture that provided both grain crops and livestock, making their communities less vulnerable to supply chain disruptions. The social structure of post-Roman Britain was also in flux. The rigid class distinctions of Roman society, senators, equites, citizens, and slaves, were breaking down as political authority fragmented. In their place, new forms of social organization emerged based on personal relationships and military service, rather than inherited status or imperial appointment. This social fluidity created opportunities for ambitious individuals like Hengist to rise to positions of power that would have been impossible under Roman rule. A Germanic warrior who had no legal status in the imperial system could become a king in post-Roman Britain simply by gathering enough followers and controlling enough territory to make his authority effective. The military technology of the period reflected this transition between Roman and post-Roman worlds. Roman-style infantry units, fighting in disciplined formations with standardized equipment, gave way to Germanic warrior bands emphasizing individual combat skills and personal weapons. The pattern-welded swords carried by Saxon nobles represented the highest achievements of Germanic metallurgy, while their round shields and throwing spears reflected tactical doctrines developed for fighting in small groups rather than large armies. Fortification styles were also changing. Roman military engineering had emphasized permanent stone walls and complex defensive systems designed to withstand siege warfare. Post-Roman fortifications tended to be simpler but more adaptable, often featuring earthen ramparts and wooden palisades that could be constructed quickly using local materials and labor. The linguistic landscape of 5th century Britain reflected its cultural complexity. Latin remained the language of literacy and formal administration, but various Celtic languages predominated in different regions. The arrival of Germanic settlers added another linguistic layer, with Old English beginning to emerge as a distinct language from its continental Germanic roots. This multilingual environment required political leaders like Hengist to be linguistic as well as military and diplomatic strategists. The ability to communicate effectively with British, Celtic, and Germanic populations would have been crucial for building the coalitions necessary to establish and maintain political power. As we contemplate this complex world that Hengist entered, we can begin to appreciate the magnitude of his achievement in transforming himself from a hired mercenary into the founder of a kingdom. Success required not just military prowess, but also political acumen, cultural sensitivity, and strategic vision. The man who would build Kent understood that conquest alone was not enough. Lasting power required the ability to create new institutions and relationships that could survive the founder's death and provide stability for future generations. The Roman world was ending, but the medieval world had not yet begun. In this liminal space between empires, ambitious individuals like Hengist could reshape the map of Britain and establish dynasties that would endure for centuries. The stage was set for one of history's most remarkable transformations, the birth of Anglo-Saxon England. The relationship between Hengist and Horsa forms one of the most compelling elements in the foundation story of Kent, embodying both the Germanic ideal of brotherhood in arms and the tragic reality that not all heroes survive to see their dreams fulfilled. To understand their partnership, we must delve into the cultural and personal bonds that united these two remarkable men in their quest to establish a new realm in Britain. The Germanic tradition from which both brothers emerged placed enormous emphasis on kinship bonds, particularly those between siblings who shared not only blood, but also the dangerous profession of warfare. In the halls of their ancestors, tales were told of legendary brother pairs who had achieved great deeds through mutual loyalty and complementary skills. The mythological resonance of their names, Hengist the stallion and Horsa the horse, suggests that their story may have incorporated elements of these ancient heroic traditions. Yet beyond any mythological significance, Hengist and Horsa were practical men, dealing with the immediate challenges of establishing themselves in a foreign land. Their partnership represented a division of labor that maximized their collective effectiveness while minimizing the risks inherent in their ambitious undertaking. Hengist, the elder by several years, naturally assumed the role of strategic planner and political negotiator, while Horsa took responsibility for direct military leadership and the morale of their warrior followers. Archaeological evidence from Germanic burial sites suggests that the brothers would have been raised in a society where martial skills were cultivated from early childhood. Young nobles like Hengist and Horsa would have begun weapons training around age 7, starting with wooden practice swords and progressing to real steel as they demonstrated competence and responsibility. By adolescence, they would have been expected to participate in hunting expeditions that doubled as military training, learning to work as part of a team while developing the individual courage and skill that Germanic warfare demanded. The weapons that the brothers carried reflected both their social status and their personal fighting preferences. Hengist's sword, described in later sources as a magnificent pattern-welded blade, would have been worth more than a common man's entire possessions. The complex process of pattern welding involved folding and refolding steel hundreds of times to create distinctive wave-like patterns in the metal, producing a blade that was both beautiful and deadly. Such weapons were often given names and treated almost as living companions, passed down through generations of warriors who added to their legendary status with each victory. Horsa's weapons may have reflected his more direct approach to warfare. While he certainly carried a sword befitting his noble rank, sources suggest he favored the Francisca, a distinctive Germanic throwing axe that could be hurled with devastating effect before closing to hand-to-hand combat. The Francisca required enormous skill to use effectively, as the thrower needed to judge distance precisely to ensure the axe would complete the proper number of rotations to strike blade first. Mastery of this weapon marked Horsa as a warrior of exceptional ability and training. The military organization that the brothers established in Britain reflected Germanic traditions of warrior fellowship rather than Roman concepts of disciplined military hierarchy. Their followers were not merely soldiers, but sworn companions, bound by sacred oaths that created obligations extending far beyond simple military service. Each warrior owed his lord absolute loyalty in battle, while the lord was obligated to provide protection, sustenance, and a fair share of any treasure acquired through victory. This system of mutual obligation created extremely tight-knit military units, but also limited their potential size. A leader could only maintain personal relationships with a finite number of followers, typically no more than a few hundred warriors. Expansion beyond this limit required the establishment of subordinate war bands led by trusted lieutenants, creating a network of relationships that could become complex and potentially unstable if not managed carefully. Hengist's genius lay in his ability to adapt this traditional Germanic system to the conditions he found in post-Roman Britain. Rather than simply transplanting continental social structures, he modified them to incorporate British elements while retaining their essential Germanic character. This hybridization allowed his followers to integrate more effectively with the existing population, while maintaining their distinct identity and military advantages. The brothers' initial campaigns against the Picts provided opportunities to test and refine their military methods, while building the reputation that would attract additional followers from the continent. Germanic warfare emphasized mobility, surprise, and individual heroism, rather than the set-piece battles favored by Roman tactical doctrine. Against the Picts, who employed similar guerrilla methods, Saxon forces proved particularly effective because their warriors were accustomed to fighting as individuals or in small groups, rather than as part of large formations. Horsa's role in these campaigns extended beyond mere battlefield leadership to encompass the crucial function of inspiring his men through personal example. Germanic military culture placed enormous value on visible courage, and warriors would judge their leaders' worthiness based on their willingness to share danger and hardship. A leader who remained safely in the rear while his men faced death would quickly lose their respect and loyalty, regardless of his strategic brilliance or political connections. The distribution of treasure following successful campaigns provided another opportunity for the brothers to demonstrate their leadership qualities while strengthening the bonds that held their war band together. Germanic custom required leaders to be generous with their followers, sharing captured wealth according to each warrior's contribution to the victory. This practice served practical as well as cultural purposes, ensuring that successful campaigns generated the resources needed to maintain warrior loyalty while attracting new recruits drawn by the promise of rich rewards. Hengist's political acumen complemented Horsa's military leadership in ways that maximized their effectiveness as a team. While Horsa focused on maintaining warrior morale and battlefield effectiveness, Hengist developed the relationships with British leaders that would ultimately provide opportunities for territorial expansion. His marriage negotiations with Vortigern represented a masterpiece of diplomatic strategy, transforming the Saxons from hired mercenaries into potential rulers through a combination of personal charm and calculated political pressure. The cultural differences between Germanic and British society created both opportunities and challenges for the brothers as they established themselves in Kent. Germanic legal traditions emphasized personal honor and direct action, while British law retained Roman influences, emphasizing written contracts and administrative procedure. Germanic religion honored war gods and celebrated heroic death in battle, while British Christianity promoted peace and forgiveness. These differences required careful navigation to avoid unnecessary conflicts, while positioning the Saxons advantageously for future expansion. The brothers' approach to these cultural challenges reflected their different personalities and areas of responsibility. Hengist demonstrated remarkable flexibility in adapting to British customs when it served his purposes, learning Latin, participating in Roman-style diplomatic ceremonies, and even showing respect for Christian symbols when necessary. This cultural adaptability, rather than representing weakness or betrayal of Germanic identity, reflected the sophisticated political intelligence that would ultimately make him a successful ruler. Horsa, by contrast, remained more closely tied to traditional Germanic values and practices, His role as military leader required him to maintain the loyalty of Saxon warriors, who might have viewed excessive accommodation to British customs as weakness or betrayal. By preserving traditional Germanic martial culture within his warband, while his brother handled diplomatic relations, Horsa ensured that their forces retained their distinctive military advantages while avoiding the cultural assimilation that might have undermined their effectiveness. The religious dimension of the brothers' leadership created particular complexities, given the mixture of pagan and Christian influences in post-Roman Britain. As followers of Woden and the Germanic pantheon, Hengist and Horsa represented a potential threat to the Christian identity that British elites were attempting to establish. Yet their political success required them to work within existing British institutions, many of which had strong Christian associations. Hengist's solution to this dilemma demonstrated his characteristic pragmatism. Rather than engaging in direct religious confrontation, he simply avoided theological disputes while focusing on practical political and military cooperation. This approach allowed him to work effectively with Christian British leaders like Vortigern, while maintaining the loyalty of his pagan Saxon followers. The religious question could be addressed later, once political control was more firmly established. The evolution of the brothers' relationship over their years in Britain reflected the changing nature of their mission from temporary military service to permanent territorial establishment. Initially, both men may have viewed their British adventure as a potentially lucrative but ultimately temporary assignment that would provide wealth and glory to take back to their continental homeland. As opportunities for permanent settlement became apparent, their partnership evolved to reflect new responsibilities and long-term goals. This evolution created new strains as well as new opportunities. The transition from warband leader to territorial ruler required different skills and priorities than those needed for successful mercenary service. Questions of succession, territorial administration, and relationship with the broader British population became increasingly important as the brothers' power and influence grew. The tragic element in their story, Horsa's death in battle against British forces, represented both a personal loss for Hengist and a significant political challenge for the emerging Saxon kingdom. Horsa's death removed not only Hengist's closest advisor and most trusted military commander, but also a key symbol of Saxon legitimacy and continuity. The manner of his death, fighting courageously against overwhelming odds, enhanced his legendary status while creating practical problems for his surviving brother. In the Germanic tradition, a warrior's death in battle was the most honorable ending to a life of service, ensuring his place in the halls of the gods while inspiring his followers to similar acts of courage. Horsa's death thus served to strengthen rather than weaken the mythological foundation of Saxon power in Kent, providing a heroic origin story that would inspire future generations of warriors. For Hengist personally, the loss of his brother marked the end of a partnership that had defined his adult life and the beginning of a more solitary phase of leadership. The decisions he would make in the years following Horsa's death would determine not only his own fate, but also the future of the kingdom they had begun to build together. The foundation they had laid would prove strong enough to support the dynasty that would rule Kent for centuries. But the cost of that achievement was measured in the blood of heroes. The circumstances that brought Hengist and Horsa to British shores in 449 CE were the product of a complex web of political, military, and personal factors that had been developing for decades. To understand the magnitude of Vortigern's decision to invite Germanic mercenaries into his realm, we must examine the desperate situation facing post-Roman Britain and the calculations that led a British king to place his trust in foreign warriors. The withdrawal of Roman legions from Britain in 410 CE had left a power vacuum that local strongmen struggled to fill. Unlike other former Roman provinces where barbarian kingdoms emerged relatively quickly, Britain experienced a prolonged period of political fragmentation. Multiple claimants competed for control of different regions, while external enemies pressed against every frontier. Into this chaos stepped Vortigern, whose very name may have been a title meaning High King, rather than a personal identifier. Vortigern's rise to power represented an attempt to recreate imperial authority using British resources and personnel. He established his court at what may have been Gloucester, positioning himself to control the vital corridor between Wales and the English lowlands. From this central location, he could respond to threats from multiple directions while maintaining communication with the various sub-kingdoms that acknowledged his overlordship. Yet Vortigern's authority, impressive though it appeared on the surface, rested on foundations that were inherently unstable. Unlike Roman emperors who commanded professional legions loyal to the imperial system, Vortigern depended on personal relationships with local nobles who maintained their own military forces. These relationships were constantly shifting as political circumstances changed and new opportunities arose. The military challenges facing Vortigern's regime were formidable and multifaceted. To the north, Pictish raids had intensified following the Roman withdrawal, with painted warriors striking deep into former Roman territory before retreating to the safety of the Scottish Highlands. These raids were not random acts of violence but carefully planned operations designed to capture slaves, livestock, and precious metals, while avoiding decisive confrontation with British forces. Pictish military tactics reflected generations of experience fighting Roman armies. They excelled at guerrilla warfare, using their intimate knowledge of highland terrain to appear suddenly where least expected, strike quickly at vulnerable targets, and disappear before effective resistance could be organized. Their war bands were small and highly mobile, capable of living off the land for extended periods while penetrating far from their northern strongholds. The Irish threat was equally serious, but different in character. Irish raiders, known to the Romans as Scotti, operated primarily from the sea, using their superior naval technology to strike at coastal settlements throughout western Britain. Their curraghs, lightweight boats constructed from wooden frames covered with waterproofed hide, could be carried overland when necessary and launched from any suitable beach. Irish raiding expeditions sought primarily human captives who could be sold in continental slave markets or used as agricultural workers in Ireland itself. The disruption caused by these slave raids extended far beyond their immediate victims, as coastal communities were forced to relocate inland or invest heavily in fortifications that diverted resources from productive activities. Perhaps most dangerously for Vortigern's long-term stability, he faced internal opposition from rivals who questioned his legitimacy and sought to establish independent kingdoms. The concept of unified British resistance to external threats, so appealing to later Romantic historians, had little foundation in 5th century political reality. British nobles were often more interested in defeating domestic rivals than in cooperating against foreign enemies. This internal instability was exacerbated by economic problems stemming from the breakdown of Roman commercial networks. The sophisticated monetary economy that had supported Roman administration was collapsing as silver coins became scarce and complex supply chains were disrupted by barbarian invasions on the continent. Local economies were forced to become more self-sufficient, reducing the resources available for maintaining large military forces. Religious divisions added another layer of complexity to Vortigern's challenges. Christianity had made significant progress among British elites during the later Roman period, but pagan beliefs persisted among rural populations and certain noble families. These religious differences often aligned with political factions, creating additional sources of conflict within British society. The decision to hire Germanic mercenaries was not unprecedented in Roman military history. For centuries, the empire had employed barbarian foederati, allied troops who served under treaty arrangements rather than direct imperial command. These arrangements had often proved mutually beneficial, providing the Romans with effective military forces while offering barbarian leaders opportunities for wealth and advancement within the imperial system. What made Vortigern's situation unique was his lack of imperial resources to support such arrangements. Roman emperors could offer Germanic leaders citizenship, military rank, and regular payment in silver coins backed by the empire's vast wealth. Vortigern possessed none of these advantages, forcing him to rely on more precarious arrangements based on personal relationships and promises of future rewards. The Germanic peoples from whom Vortigern sought military assistance were themselves experiencing significant changes in the mid-5th century. Climate change and population pressure in their continental homelands were creating incentives for migration, while the collapse of Roman frontier defenses was opening new opportunities for expansion. Young warriors who might previously have sought service in Roman armies now looked elsewhere for advancement and adventure. Hengist and Horsa represented a new generation of Germanic leaders who understood that the old world of Roman domination was ending and that new opportunities existed for those bold enough to seize them. Unlike earlier Germanic nobles who had sought integration into Roman society, they envisioned creating entirely new political arrangements that would combine Germanic military traditions with territorial control over former Roman populations. The initial contact between Vortigern and the Saxon brothers likely occurred through intermediaries who maintained connections across the North Sea. Archaeological evidence suggests that trade relationships between Britain and the Germanic regions had continued even after the official end of Roman rule, creating networks that could facilitate diplomatic as well as commercial communication. The negotiations that brought Hengist and Horsa to Britain would have involved complex discussions about payment, territorial arrangements, and command relationships. Unlike simple mercenary contracts, these agreements established what amounted to a military alliance between sovereign powers, with each side contributing specific resources towards shared objectives. Vortigern's offer to the Saxon brothers included not only immediate payment for military services, but also the grant of land on the Isle of Thanet, where they could establish a permanent base. This territorial concession represented a significant departure from traditional Roman practice, which had generally avoided giving barbarian allies control over imperial territory. The implications of this decision would only become clear as events unfolded. For Hengist and Horsa, the British invitation represented an unprecedented opportunity to establish themselves as territorial rulers, rather than mere warband leaders. The decline of Roman power meant that successful military commanders could potentially carve out independent kingdoms without facing the overwhelming imperial response that would have crushed such ambitions in earlier centuries. The logistics of organizing and transporting a Saxon military expedition to Britain would have required considerable planning and resources. Ships capable of carrying warriors, weapons, and supplies across the North Sea were expensive to build and maintain. Recruiting sufficient numbers of quality warriors required extensive networks of personal relationships and the promise of substantial rewards for successful participants. The Saxon force that eventually made the crossing to Britain numbered perhaps 200 warriors, a significant military commitment for a Germanic leader, but not large enough to pose an immediate threat to British security. This carefully calculated size allowed Hengist to bring sufficient force to be militarily effective, while avoiding the impression that he was planning conquest rather than mercenary service. The warriors who accompanied the brothers to Britain represented the elite of Germanic military society. These were not desperate refugees or common farmers seeking new homes, but professional fighters who had chosen to risk their lives in pursuit of wealth and glory. Each warrior would have been equipped with expensive weapons and armor, trained from childhood in combat techniques, and bound by sacred oaths to their leaders. The ships that carried this force across the North Sea were marvels of Germanic naval technology, built from oak planks sewn together with leather thongs and sealed with resin. These vessels were sturdy enough to survive ocean storms while remaining light enough to be beached on any suitable shore. Their shallow draft allowed navigation in coastal waters where Roman galleys could not venture, providing tactical advantages for amphibious operations. The crossing itself would have been a dangerous undertaking even under favorable conditions. The North Sea in winter could be treacherous, with sudden storms capable of sinking entire fleets. Navigation relied on observation of stars, wind patterns and bird flights, requiring considerable skill and experience from Saxon navigators. The successful completion of the voyage demonstrated not only the technical competence of Hengists' followers, but also their commitment to the enterprise. The landing at Ebbsfleet on the Isle of Thanet was carefully chosen for its strategic advantages. The location provided easy access to the British mainland, while offering security for the Saxon base. The Wonsum Channel that separated Thanet from Kent proper was wide enough to deter casual raiders, but narrow enough to be crossed quickly when military action was required. Vortigern's personal reception of the Saxon leaders demonstrated the importance he placed on this military alliance. The British king would have travelled from his court to meet Hengist and Horsa personally, bringing with him a retinue that displayed his wealth and authority. This initial meeting established the personal relationships that would prove crucial as events developed. The terms of the alliance negotiated at this first meeting reflected the complex political situation facing both parties. Vortigern needed immediate military assistance against external enemies, while Hengist required secure basing arrangements and reliable payment for his services. The agreement they reached attempted to balance these competing needs while establishing frameworks for future cooperation. The successful conclusion of these negotiations marked the beginning of a relationship that would transform both Saxon and British society. For Vortigern, the alliance promised relief from immediate military pressures while providing access to the most effective warriors available in the post-Roman world. For Hengist and Horsa, it offered opportunities for advancement that would have been impossible in their continental homeland. Yet even as the alliance was being celebrated, the seeds of future conflict were being sown. The Saxon warriors who began establishing themselves on Thanet were not merely temporary visitors, but potential permanent settlers with their own ambitions and loyalties. The territorial concessions that Vortigern viewed as necessary military arrangements would soon be seen by his British subjects as unacceptable surrenders of sovereignty to foreign invaders. The stage was thus set for one of the most dramatic transformations in British history. What began as a straightforward military alliance between a British king and Germanic mercenaries would evolve into something far more complex and consequential: the establishment of the first Anglo-Saxon kingdom on British soil, and the beginning of the end for post-Roman British independence. The initial military operations conducted by Hengist and Horsa in service to Vortigern revealed both the devastating effectiveness of Saxon warfare and the strategic vision that would ultimately transform these hired mercenaries into territorial rulers. These early campaigns, fought against Pictish raiders from the north and Irish marauders from the west, provided the Saxon brothers with invaluable intelligence about British geography, politics, and military capabilities. while establishing their reputation as the most formidable warriors in post-Roman Britain. The first test of Saxon military prowess came within months of their arrival, when Pictish war bands launched a major raid deep into British territory. These painted warriors, whose very name struck fear into the hearts of Romanized Britons, had perfected the art of guerrilla warfare during centuries of conflict with imperial legions. They moved swiftly through highland terrain, struck at isolated settlements, and withdrew before local forces could respond effectively. The Pictish military system was fundamentally different from both Roman and Germanic traditions, where Romans emphasized disciplined formations and standardized equipment, and Germans valued individual heroism and personal weapons. The Picts relied on intimate knowledge of local terrain and the ability to appear and disappear like spirits of the mountains. Their warriors painted their bodies with blue pigment derived from woad, creating terrifying appearances that added psychological warfare to their tactical advantages. Pictish raids typically targeted specific objectives rather than seeking general devastation. Their primary goals were the capture of slaves who could be sold in continental markets, the acquisition of precious metals and finished goods that were scarce in their highland homes, and the demonstration of strength that would deter British retaliation. These raids were carefully planned operations, rather than random acts of violence, often involving reconnaissance missions that preceded the main assault by weeks or months. When news reached Vortigern's court that a major Pictish force had penetrated as far south as the River Trent, threatening the vital agricultural regions of the British Midlands, the king immediately called upon his Saxon allies to demonstrate their worth. This moment represented the first real test of the military alliance and would determine whether Vortigern's controversial decision to hire Germanic mercenaries would prove justified. Hengist's response to this crisis revealed the strategic thinking that would later make him a successful ruler. Rather than simply pursuing the Pictish raiders in a conventional chase that would likely fail, he analyzed their probable routes of retreat and positioned his forces to intercept them at river crossings and mountain passes, where their mobility advantages would be reduced. The Saxon war band that set out to confront the Picts numbered approximately 150 warriors, a force that might have seemed inadequate against several hundred raiders. However, Hengist understood that the effectiveness of his men lay not in their numbers, but in their superior equipment, training, and tactical methods. Each Saxon warrior represented an investment in weapons and armor worth more than a common man's annual income, while their lifetime of combat training made them individually superior to most opponents. Saxon military equipment reflected the sophisticated metallurgical skills of Germanic craftsmen. The pattern-welded swords carried by noble warriors combined both beauty and functionality. Their wave-like surface patterns created by folding and refolding steel hundreds of times to eliminate impurities and create blades of extraordinary strength and sharpness. These weapons were often given names and treated as almost mystical companions, passed down through generations of warriors who added to their legendary status with each victory. The round shields used by Saxon warriors were constructed from multiple layers of wood covered with leather and reinforced with iron bosses. These shields could deflect spear thrusts and sword blows while being used offensively to strike opponents or create openings for counterattacks. The distinctive dome-shaped boss in the center served both protective and psychological purposes, its polished surface reflecting light in ways that could dazzle enemies while providing additional structural strength. Saxon spears represented perhaps the most versatile weapons in their arsenal. These could be used for thrusting in close combat, throwing at medium range, or forming defensive barriers when used in coordination with shields. The iron spearheads were carefully balanced to ensure accuracy when thrown. while their ash wood shafts provided the flexibility needed to absorb impact without breaking. The tactical doctrine employed by Hengist's forces emphasized individual initiative within coordinated group actions. Unlike Roman legions that fought as disciplined units following complex drill movements, Saxon warriors operated as a collection of heroes, each responsible for his own survival while contributing to collective objectives. This approach required extensive training and absolute trust between warriors, but it provided enormous tactical flexibility when facing unpredictable enemy actions. The pursuit of the Pictish raiders led Saxon forces through landscape that revealed the extent of post-Roman decline in British infrastructure. Roman roads, once maintained to exacting standards by imperial engineers, showed signs of neglect and damage that made rapid military movement difficult. Bridges that had carried legions across rivers for centuries were weakened by lack of maintenance or destroyed by earlier raids. The sophisticated communication networks that had allowed Roman commanders to coordinate operations across vast distances had largely collapsed. Yet this infrastructural decay also provided opportunities for innovative military leaders like Hengist. The breakdown of Roman administrative control meant that local populations were often willing to provide assistance to any force capable of protecting them from raiders. Saxon warriors who demonstrated their ability to defeat Pictish invaders found themselves welcomed as liberators, rather than feared as foreign intruders. The climactic encounter between Saxon and Pictish forces occurred at a river crossing in what is now northern England, where Hengist had correctly anticipated the raiders' route of retreat. The battle that followed demonstrated the fundamental differences between Germanic and Celtic approaches to warfare, while establishing Saxon military superiority in ways that would resonate throughout Britain. Pictish warriors, accustomed to fighting opponents who could be demoralized by their fearsome appearance and hit-and-run tactics, found themselves facing enemies who welcomed individual combat and could not be intimidated by psychological warfare. Saxon warriors, trained from childhood to view death in battle as the most honorable fate possible, advanced steadily against Pictish positions despite the defenders' advantages of position and familiarity with local terrain. The fighting was brutal and decisive. Horsa personally led the central assault, his war cry echoing across the battlefield as he cut down opponent after opponent with his Francisca and sword. His courage inspired his followers to acts of heroism that broke Pictish resistance and sent the surviving raiders fleeing toward their highland strongholds. The victory was complete, with most of the Pictish force either killed or captured, and their accumulated plunder recovered for return to its British owners. The immediate consequences of this victory extended far beyond the military sphere. Word of Saxon effectiveness spread rapidly throughout British society, reaching both potential enemies who now viewed Germanic warriors with increased respect and potential allies who saw opportunities for military cooperation. Vortigern's decision to hire Saxon mercenaries was vindicated in the most dramatic way possible, while Hengist and Horsa found their reputations enhanced beyond anything they had achieved in their continental homeland. The treatment of prisoners taken in this battle revealed important aspects of Saxon military culture that would influence their future relationships with British populations. Unlike the often brutal practices associated with barbarian warfare, Hengist ordered that captured Picts be treated according to Germanic codes of honor that recognized the courage they had shown in battle. Some prisoners were ransomed back to their tribes, while others were offered opportunities to join Saxon war bands as auxiliary warriors. This relatively humane treatment of defeated enemies served both practical and strategic purposes. Practically, it encouraged enemy surrender rather than desperate last stands that would increase Saxon casualties. Strategically, it demonstrated to British observers that Saxon rule might be preferable to the chaos and devastation associated with other barbarian groups that were ravaging former Roman territories on the continent. The success against the Picts was followed by equally impressive victories against Irish raiders who had been operating along the western coasts of Britain. These maritime enemies presented different challenges, from Highland warriors requiring Saxon forces to develop naval capabilities and amphibious tactics that would prove valuable in future operations. Irish curraghs, lightweight boats that could be launched from any suitable beach, had given Scotty raiders significant advantages over British defenders who lacked comparable naval technology. Saxon ships, while larger and more heavily built than Irish vessels, proved equally effective in coastal operations while offering superior protection for their crews during extended voyages. The campaign against Irish raiders took Saxon forces into Welsh territories, where they encountered landscapes and populations that were even more thoroughly Celtic in character than those they had previously known. The mountains of Wales had never been fully Romanized, and their inhabitants maintained cultural and linguistic traditions that dated back centuries before Roman conquest. This exposure to authentic Celtic culture provided Hengist with insights into British society that would prove valuable in future political negotiations. Welsh resistance to Irish raiders had been hampered by the same problems of coordination and resources that plagued British defensive efforts elsewhere. Local rulers maintained their own military forces, but struggled to coordinate operations across tribal boundaries. The arrival of Saxon reinforcements provided not only additional fighting power, but also neutral leadership that could bridge traditional Welsh factional divisions. The success of these joint operations between Saxon and Welsh forces demonstrated Hengist's growing understanding of British political complexities. By positioning himself as a protector of local populations rather than a conqueror, he began building the relationships that would eventually support his territorial ambitions. Welsh nobles who had initially viewed Saxon warriors with suspicion came to appreciate their effectiveness and reliability as military allies. The intelligence gathered during these campaigns provided Hengist with detailed knowledge of British geography, military capabilities, and political relationships that would prove invaluable in future operations. He learned the locations of key fortifications, the quality of local military forces, and the nature of alliances between different British rulers. This information transformed him from an outsider dependent on Vortigern's guidance into an independent actor capable of making his own strategic decisions. Perhaps most importantly, these early campaigns established patterns of Saxon-British cooperation that would persist even as political relationships evolved. British populations who had experienced Saxon protection came to view Germanic warriors not as foreign invaders, but as potential defenders against common enemies. This shift in perception would prove crucial when later conflicts arose between Saxon and British political leaders. The economic benefits of these military successes also contributed to Saxon power and influence. The recovery of plunder from defeated raiders provided Hengist with resources that could be used to attract additional followers from the continent, while rewarding his existing warriors for their service. Success bred success, as news of Saxon victories encouraged more Germanic adventurers to seek service under Hengist's banner. The religious implications of these victories created additional opportunities for Saxon influence. British Christian leaders, while maintaining theological opposition to Germanic paganism, could not ignore the practical benefits of Saxon military protection. Some began to interpret Saxon successes as evidence of divine favor, suggesting that God might be using pagan warriors to protect Christian populations from even worse enemies. As these first campaigns drew to their successful conclusions, Hengist and Horsa had achieved far more than simple military victories. They had established themselves as indispensable allies to Vortigern, while building independent relationships with British populations throughout southeastern England. Their transformation from hired mercenaries to political players in their own right was well underway, setting the stage for the dramatic events that would follow. The political masterstroke that would ultimately transform Hengist from a hired mercenary into a territorial ruler began with a seemingly simple invitation to a diplomatic feast. Yet this gathering, arranged ostensibly to celebrate Saxon military victories and strengthen the alliance between Vortigern and his Germanic allies, would set in motion events that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in post-Roman Britain and establish the foundation for the first Anglo-Saxon kingdom. The diplomatic feast that brought together British and Saxon leadership represented a culmination of several years of successful military cooperation. Hengist and Horsa had proven their worth beyond any reasonable doubt. Their warriors had protected British territories from Pictish and Irish raiders, and their reputation for effectiveness had spread throughout the former Roman province. Vortigern's decision to hire Germanic mercenaries, initially controversial among his British subjects, now appeared vindicated by practical results. Yet beneath this surface harmony, tensions were beginning to emerge that would ultimately prove irreconcilable. The success of Saxon military operations had given Hengist and his followers a detailed understanding of British strengths and weaknesses that extended far beyond mere battlefield intelligence. They had observed the fragmented nature of British political authority, the economic problems plaguing post-Roman society, and the cultural divisions that prevented effective resistance to external threats. More critically, Hengist had begun to appreciate the opportunities that British political instability created for ambitious Germanic leaders willing to think beyond traditional concepts of mercenary service. The collapse of Roman imperial authority had created a power vacuum that local strongmen like Vortigern were struggling to fill. A sufficiently clever and determined outsider might be able to insert himself into this vacuum and carve out independent territory for his followers. The decision to invite Vortigern to a formal diplomatic banquet provided Hengist with the perfect opportunity to advance his territorial ambitions through political rather than military means. Germanic tradition placed enormous emphasis on hospitality and the obligations created by shared meals between leaders. By hosting Vortigern at a feast held on Saxon territory, the Isle of Thanet, Hengist could create a social and cultural context that would maximize his negotiating advantages. The preparation for this feast demonstrated the sophistication of Saxon political culture and Hengist's understanding of the importance of ceremonial display in establishing authority and status. Saxon craftsmen worked for weeks to create the proper setting, constructing a great hall worthy of hosting such distinguished guests, while ensuring that every detail reflected Germanic values and traditions. The hall itself was a marvel of Germanic architectural achievement, built from massive oak timbers joined without nails through complex notching and joinery techniques that created structures of remarkable strength and durability. The high-peaked roof was supported by intricately carved posts depicting scenes from Germanic mythology, while the walls were hung with tapestries showing the genealogies of Saxon noble families and the great deeds of legendary heroes. At the center of the hall stood the high table where Hengist would sit with his most honored guests, including Vortigern and his retinue. The careful arrangement of seating reflected subtle but important distinctions of rank and status, with each guest's position conveying specific messages about their relationship to their Saxon hosts. This attention to ceremonial detail demonstrated Hengist's growing confidence in his ability to deal with British leaders as an equal rather than a subordinate. The feast itself showcased the wealth and sophistication that Saxon raiders had accumulated through their successful military operations. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted cattle and wild boar, fresh salmon from British rivers, and exotic delicacies acquired through continental trade networks. Mead flowed freely from ornate drinking horns, while Saxon harpers provided musical entertainment that celebrated both Germanic traditions and recent military victories. Yet the true purpose of this elaborate hospitality was not mere display, but rather the creation of social conditions that would facilitate Hengist's most audacious political gambit: the introduction of his daughter as a potential bride for the British king. This marriage proposal, carefully prepared and dramatically presented, would test Hengist's understanding of British culture, while offering Vortigern temptations that the Saxon leader hoped would prove irresistible. The young woman, who would be introduced to Vortigern as Rowena, though this may have been a name given to her by later chroniclers rather than her original Germanic appellation, had been carefully prepared for her crucial role in her father's political strategy. She possessed not only the physical beauty that contemporary sources universally praised, but also the intelligence and cultural sophistication necessary to navigate the complex social dynamics of British royal courts. Rowena's education would have included not only traditional Germanic accomplishments like textile production and household management, but also the linguistic and cultural skills necessary to function effectively in British society. She had learned to speak Latin, the language of administration and high culture in post-Roman Britain, and had been instructed in Christian customs and beliefs that would allow her to interact appropriately with British religious leaders. The dramatic presentation of Rowena to Vortigern and his retinue was choreographed to maximize its emotional and political impact. As the feast reached its climax and the influence of mead had relaxed the usual constraints of diplomatic protocol, she appeared bearing a golden cup of wine for the British king. Her beauty, grace, and evident deference to British customs created an immediate impression that went far beyond mere physical attraction. Contemporary accounts, though filtered through centuries of retelling and embellishment, consistently emphasize the overwhelming impact that Rowena's appearance had on Vortigern. Whether this reaction reflected genuine romantic attraction, political calculation, or some combination of both, the British king's immediate fascination with Hengist's daughter provided the Saxon leader with exactly the opening he had been hoping to create. The marriage negotiations that followed this dramatic introduction revealed the full extent of Hengist's political sophistication and his transformation from simple mercenary leader into a strategic thinker capable of reshaping the political map of Britain. Rather than simply offering his daughter in exchange for additional payments or military privileges, Hengist requested something far more valuable and dangerous: territorial sovereignty over the Kingdom of Kent. This demand represented a fundamental escalation in Saxon ambitions that went far beyond anything that had been contemplated in their original mercenary agreements. Kent was not merely a piece of land, but a strategically crucial territory that controlled the shortest crossing between Britain and the continent. Its possession would give Hengist independent access to Germanic reinforcements while providing the economic resources necessary to support a territorial kingdom, rather than a simple warband. From Vortigern's perspective, the marriage proposal offered both irresistible attractions and serious dangers that he may not have fully appreciated in his infatuation with Rowena. The alliance with Hengist that such a marriage would create could strengthen his position against both external enemies and internal rivals, while the Saxon leader's proven military capabilities would provide valuable security for Vortigern's realm. Yet granting territorial sovereignty to Germanic allies also represented an unprecedented departure from traditional British and Roman concepts of political authority. Previous arrangements with barbarian allies had involved service relationships that preserved ultimate sovereignty in British hands. What Hengist was requesting amounted to the creation of an independent Germanic kingdom within what had previously been British territory. The broader political implications of this marriage alliance extended far beyond the immediate relationship between Vortigern and Hengist. Other British nobles, many of whom had already questioned Vortigern's reliance on Germanic mercenaries, would view the grant of Kent to Saxon rulers as an unacceptable surrender of British sovereignty. The marriage would thus create new sources of internal opposition, while potentially encouraging other Germanic leaders to seek similar territorial arrangements. The religious dimensions of the proposed marriage added another layer of complexity to an already difficult political situation. Vortigern, while not necessarily a devout Christian himself, ruled over populations that were increasingly Christian in their identity and loyalties. His marriage to a pagan Saxon princess would create theological as well as political problems, potentially alienating Christian bishops and nobles whose support was crucial for maintaining his authority. Hengist's willingness to allow or even encourage his daughter's conversion to Christianity demonstrated his pragmatic approach to religious questions and his understanding that political success might require accommodation to British cultural expectations. Unlike some Germanic leaders who viewed religious conversion as betrayal of ancestral traditions, Hengist apparently recognized that theological flexibility could serve strategic purposes. The negotiations surrounding the marriage alliance also revealed the extent to which Saxon culture had begun to adapt to British conditions and expectations. While maintaining their essential Germanic identity and military traditions, Hengist and his followers had learned to operate effectively within the political and cultural frameworks they encountered in post-Roman Britain. The wedding ceremony itself, when it finally took place, represented a fascinating blend of British, Roman, and Germanic traditions that reflected the complex cultural mixing that was beginning to characterize southeastern England under Saxon influence. Christian elements provided by British bishops were combined with Germanic customs involving oaths of mutual loyalty and protection, while Roman legal traditions supplied frameworks for defining the territorial and political arrangements that would govern the marriage alliance. The immediate aftermath of the marriage saw Hengist's formal installation as ruler of Kent, a moment that marked the transformation of Saxon presence in Britain from temporary military service to permanent territorial control. This transition was celebrated by Saxon warriors, while being viewed with alarm by many British observers who recognized it as a fundamental shift in the political balance of power. The success of Hengist's marriage strategy encouraged other Germanic leaders to seek similar arrangements, contributing to the broader pattern of Saxon territorial expansion that would characterize the following decades. What had begun as an isolated experiment in British-Saxon cooperation became a model for the gradual transformation of post-Roman Britain into Anglo-Saxon England. Yet even as Hengist celebrated his political triumph, the seeds of future conflict were being sown by the very success of his territorial ambitions. British nobles who had reluctantly accepted Saxon military assistance now found themselves confronting Saxon political control, a development that many viewed as both unacceptable and reversible. The stage was being set for the violent confrontations that would ultimately determine whether Hengist's kingdom would survive its founder. The transformation of Hengist from mercenary commander to territorial king represented one of the most remarkable political achievements of the post-Roman period, requiring not only military prowess, but also the sophisticated understanding of governance that would allow Saxon authority to take root in British soil. The establishment of the Kingdom of Kent as a functioning political entity involved far more than simple conquest. It demanded the creation of new institutions, relationships, and cultural arrangements that could bridge the gap between Germanic traditions and British expectations. The geographical boundaries of Hengist's new kingdom were defined by both strategic necessity and practical limitations. Kent's position in southeastern England made it the natural gateway for communication and trade with the continent, while its relative geographic isolation, bounded by the Thames to the north, the English Channel to the south and east, and the Great Wealden Forest to the west, provided natural defensive barriers that would make the kingdom easier to defend against potential attackers. Within these boundaries, Hengist found a landscape that had been shaped by 4 centuries of Roman occupation, but was now reverting to more traditional patterns of settlement and land use. Roman villas, once the centers of sophisticated agricultural estates, were often abandoned or converted to simpler uses as their complex support systems broke down. Roman towns like Canterbury maintained some of their urban functions, but on a reduced scale that reflected the broader economic decline affecting post-Roman Britain. The population that Hengist now ruled was a complex mixture of Celtic Britons, earlier Germanic settlers, and Roman descendants who had remained in Britain after the imperial withdrawal. Each group brought its own traditions, expectations, and loyalties that had to be carefully managed if Saxon rule was to achieve stability and legitimacy. The success of Hengist's kingdom would depend largely on his ability to create political arrangements that could accommodate this diversity while maintaining Saxon military and cultural dominance. The initial framework for Saxon governance in Kent drew heavily on Germanic traditions of personal loyalty and mutual obligation between rulers and subjects. Unlike Roman administrative systems that emphasized bureaucratic hierarchy and written law, Saxon political culture was based on face-to-face relationships between leaders and followers who were bound together by sacred oaths and shared participation in military activities. This traditional Germanic approach to governance had to be modified to accommodate the needs of territorial rule over settled populations rather than leadership of mobile war bands. Hengist needed to establish authority over farmers and craftsmen who would never participate in military campaigns, while also maintaining the loyalty of Saxon warriors whose primary allegiance was to him personally rather than to abstract concepts of territorial sovereignty. The solution that emerged represented a sophisticated blend of Germanic and British traditions that would become characteristic of Anglo-Saxon political development. Saxon nobles received grants of land that carried with them responsibilities for maintaining order and collecting tribute within specific geographic areas, while British landowners who accepted Saxon authority were often allowed to retain their property in exchange for acknowledgement of Hengist's overlordship. This system of delegated authority allowed Hengist to extend his control throughout Kent without requiring the massive administrative apparatus that had supported Roman rule. Local governance remained largely in the hands of traditional leaders who understood local conditions and customs, while strategic oversight and military command remained concentrated in Saxon hands. The economic foundations of Hengist's kingdom reflected both the opportunities and challenges created by the breakdown of Roman commercial networks. The sophisticated monetary economy that had characterized imperial administration was largely defunct, forcing new arrangements based on land grants, agricultural tribute, and barter relationships that could function without regular access to coin money. Kent's position as the gateway to continental Europe provided significant economic advantages that Hengist was quick to exploit. Trade relationships with Germanic regions across the North Sea brought not only material goods, but also reinforcements in the form of additional warriors and settlers who strengthened Saxon control while contributing specialized skills to the developing kingdom. Archaeological evidence suggests that Saxon Kent quickly became a centre for the production of high-quality metalwork, jewellery, and weapons that combined Germanic artistic traditions with techniques and materials acquired through trade with Britain and the continent. This craft production provided both economic benefits and cultural prestige that enhanced the kingdom's reputation and attracted additional settlers and allies. The agricultural foundation of the kingdom required careful attention to the needs and traditions of the British farming population, who produced the food surplus necessary to support Saxon warriors and administrators. Unlike some barbarian successors to Roman rule, who simply extracted tribute without regard for long-term productivity, Hengist appears to have understood that his kingdom's survival depended on maintaining agricultural prosperity, rather than simply consuming inherited Roman wealth. The legal framework that governed daily life in Saxon Kent represented another area where Germanic and British traditions had to be reconciled. Saxon customary law, based on concepts of personal honour and direct action, differed significantly from Roman legal principles that emphasized written codes and administrative procedure. The resulting hybrid system allowed for flexibility in addressing local disputes while maintaining ultimate Saxon authority over major questions of governance and military service. Religious arrangements within the kingdom created particular challenges given the mixture of Christian, pagan, and syncretistic beliefs among the population. Hengist's own paganism and that of his Saxon followers represented a direct challenge to the Christian identity that British elites were attempting to establish. Yet outright religious persecution would have created unnecessary opposition and instability. The pragmatic solution that emerged involved a policy of religious tolerance that allowed Christian and pagan communities to coexist as long as both accepted Saxon political authority. This arrangement was facilitated by the growing influence of Rowena, whose conversion to Christianity provided a bridge between Saxon leadership and British religious communities, while demonstrating that Germanic rule did not necessarily threaten Christian identity. The military organization of the kingdom reflected Hengist's understanding that Saxon control depended ultimately on military superiority rather than administrative efficiency or popular consent. The core of his military force remained the war band of professional Saxon warriors who had accompanied him from the continent, supplemented by newer arrivals who were attracted by the kingdom's growing reputation and opportunities for advancement. These professional warriors formed the backbone of a military system that could respond quickly to external threats while maintaining internal order through a combination of respected authority and implicit force. The mobility and striking power of Saxon military units made them far more effective than the fragmented and poorly coordinated forces that characterized most post-Roman British territories. The fortifications that protected Saxon Kent were designed to take advantage of both the kingdom's geographic situation and the tactical preferences of Germanic warfare. Rather than relying primarily on static defenses like Roman walls and fortresses, Saxon military engineers emphasized mobile defense systems that could channel enemy attacks into areas where they could be countered effectively by rapid response forces. The capital of the kingdom was established at Canterbury, the former Roman city of Duravernum, whose strategic location and existing infrastructure made it an ideal centre for Saxon administration. The choice of Canterbury as a capital also demonstrated Hengist's intention to present himself as a legitimate successor to Roman authority, rather than simply a barbarian conqueror who rejected civilized traditions. The modification of Canterbury to serve Saxon needs involved both practical improvements and symbolic changes that reflected the new political order. Saxon halls were constructed to provide appropriate settings for Germanic ceremonial activities, while existing Roman buildings were adapted to serve administrative functions that differed from their original imperial purposes. The establishment of diplomatic relationships with other powers demonstrated Hengist's growing confidence in his kingdom's independence and his understanding of the broader political context within which Saxon Kent would have to operate. Diplomatic contacts were maintained with other Germanic groups on the continent, providing sources of reinforcement and trade, while also offering opportunities to influence continental developments in ways that would benefit Saxon interests. Relationships with other British kingdoms required more delicate handling, as Hengist needed to balance his desire for expansion against the need to avoid provoking coalitions that might threaten Saxon survival. The diplomatic approach that emerged involved a combination of military deterrence, territorial agreements, and marriage alliances that established Saxon Kent as a major player in post-Roman British politics. The cultural development of Saxon Kent reflected the creative synthesis of Germanic and British traditions that characterized all aspects of the kingdom's evolution. Saxon artistic traditions in metalwork and poetry, combined with British craftsmanship and Latin learning to create new cultural forms that were distinctively Anglo-Saxon, rather than simply continental Germanic or post-Roman British. This cultural synthesis was facilitated by the growing population of individuals who moved between Saxon and British communities, learning both languages and customs, while developing personal relationships that transcended ethnic boundaries. These cultural intermediaries played crucial roles in reducing tensions and misunderstandings that might otherwise have led to conflicts. The educational institutions that developed in Saxon Kent reflected the practical needs of governance, as well as cultural preferences. While maintaining Germanic traditions of oral poetry and heroic narrative, Saxon leaders also recognized the value of Latin literacy for administrative purposes and diplomatic communication with other former Roman territories. As Hengist's reign progressed, the Kingdom of Kent evolved from a military occupation into a functioning society that combined the best elements of both Germanic and British traditions. This achievement represented not only a personal triumph for Hengist, but also a successful model for the establishment of barbarian successor states that would be emulated throughout former Roman territories in Western Europe. The success of Saxon Kent provided inspiration and practical guidance for other Germanic leaders who sought to establish their own territorial kingdoms in Britain. The techniques of governance, military organization, and cultural adaptation that Hengist had developed would be copied and modified by successive waves of Anglo-Saxon expansion, ultimately leading to the transformation of most of Britain into Anglo-Saxon England. Yet even as Hengist celebrated the establishment of his kingdom, forces were gathering that would challenge Saxon control and test whether the political arrangements he had created could survive the violent confrontations that lay ahead. The very success of Saxon expansion had begun to generate the opposition that would define the next phase of British history. The transformation of Hengist from invited mercenary to territorial king had not occurred in a political vacuum, and the establishment of Saxon control over Kent inevitably generated responses from British leaders who viewed Germanic expansion as an existential threat to their own survival and independence. The marriage alliance between Hengist and Vortigern, initially seen as a diplomatic triumph that strengthened both parties, soon became a source of division and conflict that would tear apart the fragile political arrangements governing post-Roman Britain. The opposition to Saxon territorial expansion coalesced around Vortigern's own son, Vortimer, whose name would become synonymous with British resistance to Germanic settlement. Unlike his father, who had viewed Saxon warriors primarily as useful military tools, Vortimer recognized that Hengist's ambitions extended far beyond mercenary service and posed a fundamental challenge to British sovereignty throughout southeastern England. Vortimer's emergence as a leader of British resistance reflected broader changes in post-Roman British society that were occurring in response to Saxon success. The younger generation of British nobles had grown up in a world where Roman authority was merely a memory, and they possessed none of their elders' attachment to imperial traditions or comfort with hiring barbarian mercenaries. For these men, British identity was becoming synonymous with resistance to foreign domination, regardless of its specific form. The political coalition that gathered around Vortimer included not only British nobles who had always opposed Vortigern's Saxon alliance, but also former supporters who had been alienated by the grant of Kent to Hengist. The marriage between Vortigern and Rowena had been viewed by many British leaders as an unacceptable surrender of sovereignty that established dangerous precedents for future Germanic demands. Religious leaders played a particularly important role in mobilizing opposition to Saxon rule, as Christian bishops and monks viewed Germanic paganism as a direct threat to the Christian identity they were attempting to establish in post-Roman Britain. The presence of pagan temples and the practice of Germanic religious rituals in Kent represented not merely political challenges, but theological ones that struck at the heart of British Christian self-understanding. The military preparations undertaken by Vortimer's coalition revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of British resistance to Saxon expansion. British forces possessed numerical superiority and intimate knowledge of local terrain, while their Christian identity provided ideological motivation that went beyond simple political opposition. Yet they lacked the military cohesion and tactical sophistication that had made Saxon forces so effective in their previous campaigns. British military organization had never fully recovered from the withdrawal of Roman legions, and the fragmented political structure of post-Roman Britain made coordinated military action extremely difficult to achieve. Local rulers maintained their own forces, but struggled to integrate them into larger strategic frameworks, while the economic problems plaguing British society limited the resources available for extended military campaigns. The first clashes between Saxon and British forces occurred along the borders of Kent, where Vortimer's coalition attempted to establish control over strategic positions that could be used to contain Saxon expansion. These initial encounters revealed the fundamental differences between Germanic and British approaches to warfare, while foreshadowing the larger conflicts that would follow. Saxon tactics emphasized mobility, individual prowess, and the psychological impact of elite warriors who could break enemy formations through personal courage and superior equipment. British forces, influenced by fading memories of Roman military doctrine, attempted to employ more conventional tactics based on disciplined infantry formations and coordinated movements that proved ineffective against Saxon flexibility and aggression. The weapons and equipment used by the opposing forces reflected their different military traditions and economic capabilities. Saxon warriors continued to carry the pattern-welded swords and sophisticated armor that marked their status as professional fighters, while British forces often relied on older equipment or hastily produced weapons that lacked the quality and effectiveness of Germanic craftsmanship. The intelligence networks that both sides employed in preparation for larger conflicts demonstrated the political sophistication that had developed in post-Roman Britain. Hengist's agents maintained contacts throughout British territories, providing detailed information about enemy preparations and political developments that could be exploited to Saxon advantage. Similarly, Vortimer's supporters worked to identify potential allies and sources of supply that could sustain British resistance efforts. The economic dimensions of the developing conflict created additional challenges for both Saxon and British leaders. Extended military campaigns required resources that neither side possessed in abundance, forcing creative approaches to financing warfare that would influence the broader development of post-Roman British society. Hengist's solution involved the expansion of Saxon settlement and territorial control to create larger resource bases that could support military operations. This strategy required careful balance between the need for additional settlers and the risk of provoking stronger British resistance by making Saxon expansion too visible and threatening. The recruitment of additional Saxon warriors from continental homelands represented both an opportunity and a challenge for Hengist's kingdom. Each new arrival strengthened Saxon military capabilities, while also creating additional mouths to feed and territorial demands to satisfy. The successful integration of these newcomers required political and administrative skills that went beyond simple military leadership. Continental Germanic societies were experiencing their own pressures and opportunities that influenced their willingness to support Saxon expansion in Britain. Climate change and population pressure in traditional homelands created incentives for migration, while reports of Saxon success in establishing territorial kingdoms provided inspiration for other ambitious leaders seeking opportunities for advancement. The ships that carried Saxon reinforcements across the North Sea also facilitated communication and trade relationships that strengthened ties between continental Germanic societies and the emerging Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Britain. These connections would prove crucial for maintaining Saxon identity and culture while adapting to British conditions and challenges. British resistance efforts faced the difficult task of coordinating opposition across territories that had never been politically unified and whose leaders often had conflicting interests and ambitions. The creation of effective anti-Saxon coalitions required diplomatic skills and political compromises that many British nobles found difficult to achieve. The religious dimension of British resistance provided both unifying ideology and practical advantages that help compensate for political fragmentation. Christian identity offered a common framework that could transcend local loyalties and traditional rivalries, while church networks provided communication systems that facilitated coordination between widely separated British territories. Monastery communities, in particular, played important roles in supporting British resistance efforts by providing sanctuary for political refugees, maintaining communication networks, and preserving the intellectual traditions that would eventually contribute to British cultural revival. The monasteries also served as repositories for wealth and resources that could be mobilized for military purposes when circumstances required. The strategic thinking that guided both Saxon and British military preparations reflected sophisticated understanding of the geographical and political realities governing warfare in post-Roman Britain. Success would depend not only on battlefield victories, but also on the ability to maintain territorial control and political authority over defeated populations. Hengist's strategic approach emphasized the consolidation of Saxon control over southeastern England before attempting further expansion, recognizing that premature territorial growth could create vulnerabilities that British forces might exploit. This patient approach reflected the long-term thinking that had made him successful as both a military commander and a political leader. Vortimer's strategy focused on preventing further Saxon territorial expansion while gradually building the military and political capabilities necessary to challenge existing Saxon control over Kent. This approach required careful attention to timing and coordination, as premature action could result in decisive defeat that would end British hopes for effective resistance. The intelligence gathering and diplomatic maneuvering that preceded major military confrontations revealed the extent to which both Saxon and British leaders understood the broader implications of their conflict. This was not simply a struggle between competing war bands, but a contest that would determine the future political and cultural character of southeastern England. The psychological warfare employed by both sides reflected their understanding of the importance of morale and popular support in determining the outcomes of military campaigns. Saxon leaders emphasized their military prowess and the prosperity their rule had brought to Kent, while British resistance leaders stressed themes of patriotic duty and religious obligation that could motivate their followers to accept the sacrifices required for extended warfare. The logistical preparations undertaken by both armies demonstrated the organizational capabilities that had developed in post-Roman Britain, despite the broader breakdown of imperial administrative systems. The ability to supply, transport, and coordinate military forces over extended distances and time periods would prove crucial in determining which side could sustain the prolonged conflicts that lay ahead. As the opposing forces prepared for the confrontations that would determine the fate of Saxon Kent and British independence, both sides understood that they were participating in events that would reshape the political map of Britain for generations to come. The stakes could not have been higher, and the outcome would depend on factors ranging from individual courage and military skill to strategic vision and political leadership. The stage was set for conflicts that would test every aspect of Saxon and British society, from military effectiveness and political unity to cultural identity and religious conviction. The kingdom that Hengist had built would face its greatest challenge, while British hopes for independence would depend on their ability to overcome the fragmentation and weakness that had characterized post-Roman political development. The confrontation that would forever alter the relationship between Saxon settlers and British resistance occurred in the year 455 CE at a crossing of the River Medway near the village of Aylesford in Kent. This battle, known to history as the Battle of Aylesford, represented the first major military test of Saxon territorial control and would determine whether Hengist's kingdom could survive the coordinated British assault that Vortimer had been organizing for months. The selection of Aylesford as the site for this decisive encounter was not accidental. The river crossing represented a strategic choke point that controlled movement between the eastern and western portions of Kent, making it essential for either side that sought to control the entire kingdom. For the British forces under Vortimer, securing Aylesford would divide Saxon territories and provide a base for further operations against Canterbury and the heartland of Hengist's realm. The geographical features of the battlefield would prove crucial in determining tactical approaches and ultimate outcomes. The River Medway at this point was broad enough to prevent easy crossing, except at established fords, while the surrounding landscape of rolling hills and scattered woodlands provided opportunities for both concealment and tactical maneuvering that would influence how the battle developed. Vortimer's army represented the largest coordinated British military effort since the withdrawal of Roman legions 4 decades earlier. The force included not only warriors from his own territories, but also contingents from throughout southeastern England, whose leaders had recognized that Saxon expansion posed threats to their own independence and survival. The composition of Vortimer's army reflected both the diversity and the limitations of post-Roman British military capabilities. Noble warriors equipped with inherited Roman weapons and armor fought alongside farmers armed with agricultural tools converted for military use. Christian monks provided spiritual support and medical care, while remnants of Roman military units contributed whatever remained of their professional expertise. The British battle plan relied heavily on numerical superiority and the advantages of fighting on familiar terrain against an enemy force that would be defending established positions. Vortimer hoped to use coordinated attacks from multiple directions to overwhelm Saxon defences, while preventing Hengist from concentrating his forces effectively at crucial points. Hengist's preparations for the battle demonstrated the military sophistication that had made Saxon forces so effective in their previous campaigns. Rather than simply waiting behind static fortifications, He positioned his forces to take maximum advantage of Saxon mobility and combat effectiveness, while minimizing the impact of British numerical superiority. The Saxon army that prepared to defend Aylesford was smaller than the British force, but possessed significant advantages in terms of equipment, training, and tactical cohesion. Each Saxon warrior represented years of investment in weapons and combat skills, while their experience of fighting together as a unified force provided coordination that British armies struggled to achieve. Horsa's role in the battle preparations revealed his evolution from simple military commander to strategic thinker, capable of complex tactical planning. His understanding of British military weaknesses, gained through years of observing Vortigern's forces in action, allowed him to develop approaches that would maximize Saxon advantages while exploiting enemy vulnerabilities. The weapons and armor carried by the opposing forces reflected their different military traditions and economic capabilities. Saxon warriors bore pattern-welded swords, whose quality surpassed anything available to their British opponents, while their round shields and throwing spears were specifically designed for the individual combat style that Germanic tactics emphasized. British equipment revealed the military decline that had occurred since the end of Roman rule. Many warriors carried weapons that had been inherited from Roman predecessors or hastily manufactured from inferior materials, while the sophisticated supply systems that had once equipped imperial legions had largely collapsed, leaving British forces dependent on local production of variable quality. The preliminary skirmishing that preceded the main battle provided both sides with opportunities to assess enemy capabilities, while testing tactical approaches that would influence the larger engagement. These smaller encounters revealed Saxon superiority in individual combat skills, while demonstrating British advantages in coordinated group movements when properly organized and led. The battle itself began at dawn on a misty morning that reduced visibility and created confusion for both armies as they maneuvered for advantageous positions. The fog that rose from the River Medway provided concealment for initial movements, while adding an element of uncertainty that would influence tactical decisions throughout the engagement. Vortimer's opening assault focused on the Saxon left flank, where British forces attempted to use their numerical superiority to overwhelm defensive positions before Saxon reinforcements could respond effectively. The attack was led by Vortigern, Vortimer's brother, whose courage and tactical skill had made him one of the most respected military leaders in the British resistance movement. The initial British assault achieved temporary success as their coordinated charge broke through Saxon perimeter defences and penetrated toward the river crossing that was the battle's primary objective. For a brief moment, it appeared that British numerical superiority might overcome Saxon military advantages and secure victory for Vortimer's coalition. Horsa's response to this crisis demonstrated the tactical flexibility and personal courage that had made him legendary among Saxon warriors. Rather than attempting to coordinate a complex defensive maneuver, he led a direct counterattack that relied on individual Saxon superiority in hand-to-hand combat to break British momentum and restore Saxon control over crucial positions. The personal combat between Horsa and Vortigern that occurred during this counterattack became the focal point of the entire battle, representing not only a clash between individual warriors, but also a symbolic confrontation between Saxon expansion and British resistance. Both men embodied the highest ideals of their respective military traditions, making their encounter a test of the cultural as well as military values that each side represented. The fighting between these two heroes was fierce and prolonged, with neither gaining decisive advantage despite the superior quality of Saxon weapons and armor. Vortigern's skill and determination proved nearly equal to Horsa's experience and equipment, creating a contest that became the subject of legend long after the battle's other details had been forgotten. The tragic conclusion of this heroic encounter saw both warriors struck down simultaneously, each dealing fatal wounds to his opponent in a moment that symbolized the destructive cost of the conflict between Saxon and British societies. The death of both champions created confusion and demoralization among their followers, while eliminating two of the most capable military leaders of their generation. The loss of Horsa represented a devastating blow to Saxon morale and military capability that went far beyond the simple reduction in numbers that his death entailed. As Hengist's brother and most trusted lieutenant, Horsa had been the link between Saxon leadership and the warrior bands that formed the core of Germanic military strength in Britain. Vortigern's death was equally significant for British resistance efforts, as he had been one of the few leaders capable of coordinating effective military action across the traditional tribal boundaries that fragmented post-Roman British society. His loss removed a unifying figure whose personal relationships and military reputation had been crucial for maintaining the coalition that supported Vortimer's anti-Saxon campaign. The immediate aftermath of these simultaneous deaths created a temporary lull in the fighting, as both armies struggled to reorganize their forces and assess the new tactical situation. The shock of losing their primary military commanders forced both sides to adapt their strategies while dealing with the psychological impact of such unexpected and dramatic losses. Hengist's response to his brother's death revealed the personal grief and political calculation that would characterize his subsequent actions. The loss of Horsa was not only a devastating personal blow, but also a strategic setback that required immediate action to prevent British forces from exploiting Saxon demoralization and confusion. The tactical adjustments that Hengist implemented following Horsa's death demonstrated his evolution from warband leader to strategic commander capable of adapting to changing battlefield conditions. Rather than allowing grief to paralyze his decision-making, he focused on the practical steps necessary to maintain Saxon military effectiveness while honoring his brother's sacrifice. Vortimer's inability to capitalize on the opportunities created by the simultaneous deaths of both champions revealed the limitations of British military leadership and the coordination problems that continued to hamper their resistance efforts. Despite achieving what should have been a significant tactical advantage, British forces proved unable to transform their momentary success into decisive victory. The remainder of the battle devolved into a series of smaller engagements as both armies attempted to control key positions around the river crossing without possessing the unified leadership necessary to coordinate decisive attacks. The fighting continued throughout the day, with neither side able to achieve the breakthrough that would have provided clear victory. The eventual British withdrawal from the battlefield left Saxon forces in control of Aylesford and the strategic river crossing, but at a cost that would influence all subsequent Saxon military and political planning. The price of this tactical victory had been extraordinarily high, forcing Hengist to reconsider his approaches to territorial expansion and military confrontation. The strategic consequences of the Battle of Aylesford extended far beyond its immediate tactical outcomes. While Saxon forces had maintained control over their territory, the heavy casualties and the loss of Horsa had demonstrated the limits of their military capabilities and the determination of British resistance to Saxon expansion. For British resistance efforts, the battle represented both a tactical defeat and a strategic opportunity. While they had failed to achieve their immediate objective of dividing Saxon territory, they had proven their ability to challenge Saxon military supremacy and inflict significant casualties on Germanic forces. The propaganda value of the battle for both sides reflected the importance of morale and popular support in determining the long-term outcomes of their conflict. Saxon leaders emphasized their successful defense of Kent and the heroic sacrifice of Horsa, while British resistance leaders stressed their ability to challenge Saxon authority and the courage shown by Vortigern and his followers. The memorial monuments that were erected following the battle demonstrated the cultural importance that both societies placed on commemorating heroic sacrifice and military achievement. These monuments would serve not only as reminders of past events, but also as inspiration for future generations of warriors who would continue the conflicts that the Battle of Aylesford had begun rather than resolved. The diplomatic ramifications of the battle influenced relationships between Saxon Kent and other British kingdoms, as rulers throughout southeastern England were forced to reassess their positions regarding Saxon expansion and the effectiveness of military resistance. The demonstration that Saxon forces could be challenged successfully, albeit at great cost, encouraged some British leaders while deterring others from direct confrontation. The internal political effects of the battle on both Saxon and British societies would prove even more significant than its immediate military consequences. For Hengist, the loss of his brother created leadership challenges that would influence all aspects of Saxon government and military organization. For Vortimer, the tactical defeat raised questions about the effectiveness of his leadership and the viability of continued resistance efforts. As news of the battle spread throughout Britain and across the North Sea to continental Germanic societies, it became clear that the confrontation at Aylesford had marked a turning point in the development of post-Roman British politics. The age of unopposed Saxon expansion was ending, but the price of British resistance would prove higher than anyone had anticipated. The aftermath of the Battle of Aylesford revealed the complex and often contradictory nature of military victory in the brutal world of post-Roman Britain. While Saxon forces had successfully defended their territorial control over Kent and maintained their strategic position, the cost of this success would fundamentally alter the character of Hengist's kingdom and force dramatic changes in both military and political strategy. The immediate impact of Horsa's death extended far beyond the simple loss of a skilled military commander. As Hengist's brother and closest advisor, Horsa had served as the crucial link between Saxon leadership and the warrior bands that formed the foundation of Germanic power in Britain. His death created not only an emotional void for Hengist personally, but also a practical leadership gap that threatened the unity and effectiveness of Saxon military organization. The Germanic tradition of warrior loyalty was based on personal relationships between leaders and followers that could not easily be transferred or replaced when key figures were lost. Horsa's warriors had sworn oaths of allegiance to him personally, and his death raised questions about their continued service under different leadership arrangements. Some warriors chose to return to their continental homelands rather than serve under commanders they had not personally selected, while others transferred their loyalty to Hengist himself or to other Saxon nobles who could provide appropriate leadership. The redistribution of Horsa's warriors among other Saxon commanders required careful attention to traditional concepts of honor and status that governed Germanic military culture. Warriors who had served under a renowned hero like Horsa could not simply be assigned to lesser leaders without consideration of their own achievements and expectations for future advancement. Hengist's handling of these delicate negotiations would determine whether Saxon military strength could be maintained despite the loss of its most charismatic field commander. The political implications of Horsa's death were equally significant for the long-term stability of Saxon rule in Kent. Horsa had served not only as a military leader, but also as a symbol of Saxon legitimacy and continuity with their continental origins. His heroic death in battle against British enemies provided an inspiring narrative that could strengthen Saxon identity, but it also removed a figure whose presence had reassured Saxon settlers about their security and future prospects. The manner of Horsa's death, locked in single combat with Vortigern, while leading his men against overwhelming odds, fulfilled Germanic ideals of heroic behavior and ensured his place in the legendary traditions that would inspire future generations of Saxon warriors. This mythological status would prove valuable for maintaining Saxon morale and cultural identity, but it could not replace the practical leadership skills that were lost with his death. Hengist's personal response to his brother's death revealed the emotional depths beneath his typically calculated political facade. Contemporary accounts, though filtered through centuries of retelling, consistently describe a period of intense grief during which the Saxon king withdrew from public activities and delegated most governmental responsibilities to subordinate leaders. This temporary absence from active leadership created opportunities for both internal rivals and external enemies that could have proven disastrous for the kingdom's survival. The recovery from this period of mourning marked a significant transformation in Hengist's character and approach to leadership. The jovial and sometimes reckless warrior who had crossed the North Sea in search of adventure evolved into a more serious and calculating ruler, whose decisions were informed by a deeper understanding of the costs and risks associated with political and military action. The strategic reassessment that followed the Battle of Aylesford led to fundamental changes in Saxon approaches to territorial expansion and military confrontation. The high casualties suffered in defending Kent against British attack demonstrated that continued expansion would require either significantly larger military forces or more sophisticated tactical and political methods than had previously been employed. The recruitment of additional Saxon warriors from continental homelands became a priority that required both diplomatic skill and economic resources. Messages were sent across the North Sea describing the opportunities available in Britain, while requesting military assistance from kinsmen and allies who might be willing to seek their fortunes in foreign lands. These recruitment efforts were successful, but also carried risks, as each new arrival increased the territorial demands that would need to be satisfied through further expansion or more intensive exploitation of existing resources. The economic consequences of the battle created additional challenges for Saxon administration and military planning. The cost of equipping and maintaining professional warrior bands was enormous, requiring agricultural surpluses and trade revenues that could only be generated through effective territorial administration and economic development. The disruption caused by military campaigns interfered with these productive activities while creating additional demands for resources that were already stretched to their limits. The administrative innovations that emerged from these economic pressures represented some of Hengist's most significant achievements as a ruler. The development of more systematic approaches to taxation, land tenure, and resource allocation allowed Saxon Kent to support larger military forces while maintaining the economic foundation necessary for long-term political stability. The integration of British administrative expertise into Saxon governmental systems reflected Hengist's pragmatic recognition that effective rule required technical skills that Germanic traditions had not developed. British subjects who possessed literacy, accounting abilities, and knowledge of Roman legal traditions were gradually incorporated into Saxon administration, creating hybrid governmental systems that combined Germanic political authority with British technical competence. The military reforms implemented following Aylesford reflected lessons learned about the limitations of traditional Germanic warfare when confronted with coordinated British resistance. While maintaining the emphasis on individual warrior skill and personal loyalty that made Saxon forces so effective, Hengist also began developing tactical innovations that would improve coordination and reduce casualties in future engagements. The establishment of specialized military units trained for specific tactical roles represented a significant departure from traditional Germanic approaches that emphasized the versatility of individual warriors. Engineers trained in siege warfare, cavalry units equipped for rapid reconnaissance, and archers capable of providing supporting fire were gradually integrated into Saxon military organization, creating more flexible and effective armies. The fortification programs undertaken throughout Kent following the battle demonstrated Hengist's understanding that territorial defense required more than simply defeating enemy armies in open combat. A systematic network of fortified positions was constructed to control key strategic points while providing refuges for civilian populations during enemy raids. These fortifications were designed according to Germanic principles that emphasize mobility and tactical flexibility, rather than the massive static defenses favored by Roman military engineers. Earth and timber constructions could be built quickly, using local materials and labor, while providing adequate protection against the relatively primitive siege techniques available to British forces. The cultural impact of Horsa's death influenced Saxon identity and self-understanding in ways that would persist for generations. The transformation of a living military commander into a legendary hero provided Saxon society with a founding myth that emphasized courage, loyalty, and sacrifice, while linking their British achievements to the heroic traditions of their continental ancestors. The religious implications of these developments created additional complexities for Saxon leadership as they attempted to maintain traditional Germanic spiritual practices while adapting to the predominantly Christian environment of post-Roman Britain. Horsa's heroic death was celebrated according to pagan traditions that honored fallen warriors, but these ceremonies had to be conducted carefully to avoid unnecessary provocation of Christian British subjects. The diplomatic consequences of the Battle of Aylesford extended far beyond the immediate relationship between Saxon Kent and British resistance movements. Other Saxon leaders who were contemplating their own expeditions to Britain were forced to reassess the risks and costs associated with territorial expansion, while British kingdoms throughout the island gained confidence in their ability to resist Germanic encroachment. The intelligence networks that both sides developed following the battle reflected the increasingly sophisticated nature of post-Roman British politics. Information about military preparations, political alliances, and economic resources became crucial for survival in an environment where any advantage could determine the outcome of future conflicts. The marriage alliance between Hengist and Vortigern, which had initially seemed to provide security for Saxon territorial control, now became a source of additional complications as the political relationship between the two leaders deteriorated following the death of Vortigern's son, Catigern. The personal grief and desire for revenge that motivated Vortigern created new sources of instability that threatened the foundations of Saxon rule. The succession planning that Hengist was forced to undertake following his brother's death revealed the challenges facing barbarian kingdoms that lacked established traditions of territorial rule. Germanic customs that governed the inheritance of personal property and military leadership did not easily translate to questions of territorial sovereignty and political authority over settled populations. The emergence of Hengist's son, Oisc, as heir apparent, represented a compromise between Germanic traditions and the practical needs of territorial governance. Oisc possessed both the military skills necessary for Saxon leadership and the political intelligence required for effective rule over mixed populations, making him a suitable successor despite his youth and relative inexperience. The long-term implications of the Battle of Aylesford for the development of Anglo-Saxon England were profound and lasting. The demonstration that Saxon expansion could be challenged successfully encouraged British resistance, while forcing Germanic leaders to develop more sophisticated approaches to conquest and administration. The kingdom that emerged from these challenges would be fundamentally different from the simple military enterprise that had characterized early Saxon settlement, evolving into a complex political entity that would serve as a model for future Anglo-Saxon development throughout Britain. As Hengist contemplated the price that had been paid for his victory at Aylesford, he understood that the age of easy Saxon expansion was ending, and that future success would require political and military skills that went far beyond those needed for simple mercenary service. The kingdom he had built would survive, but only through constant vigilance and adaptation to the changing circumstances that characterized post-Roman British politics. The death of Horsa at the Battle of Aylesford created a succession crisis that would test every aspect of Saxon political organization and cultural tradition. The resolution of this crisis through the emergence of Hengist's son, Oisc, as the heir apparent, would mark a crucial transition in the development of Germanic kingship in Britain, establishing precedents for dynastic rule that would influence Anglo-Saxon political development for centuries to come. Oisc's position as Hengist's chosen successor was not automatically guaranteed by Germanic custom, which traditionally recognized the right of warrior bands to select their own leaders based on demonstrated military prowess and personal loyalty. The concept of hereditary succession, while not unknown in Germanic society, had typically been limited to situations where the designated heir possessed qualifications that made him the obvious choice for leadership, regardless of familial relationships. The young man, who emerged as Hengist's heir, possessed a unique combination of Germanic military training and British cultural sophistication that made him ideally suited for the complex challenges facing Saxon leadership in post-Roman Britain. Unlike his father, who had come to Britain as an adult with fully formed continental perspectives, Oisc had spent his formative years in Kent, learning to navigate the cultural and political complexities of British society while maintaining his Saxon identity and loyalties. Oisc's education had been carefully managed by Hengist to provide the knowledge and skills necessary for effective rule over mixed populations. Traditional Germanic warrior training was combined with instruction in Latin literacy, Christian theology, and Roman legal traditions that would allow him to communicate effectively with British subjects while understanding the administrative requirements of territorial governance. The military training that Oisc received reflected both Germanic traditions and the tactical innovations that had emerged from Saxon experiences in British warfare. His weapons training emphasized individual combat skills and the personal courage that Germanic culture valued, but also included instruction in the coordination and tactical flexibility that had proven necessary for success against British resistance movements. The political education that complemented Oisc's military training involved extensive exposure to the diplomatic and administrative challenges facing Saxon rule in Kent. He participated in negotiations with British nobles, observed the collection of tribute and taxation, and learned to balance the competing demands of Saxon warriors and British subjects that characterized daily governance in the kingdom. The cultural sophistication that Oisc developed through this comprehensive education would prove crucial for the legitimacy of his eventual rule. Unlike purely Germanic leaders who might be viewed as foreign conquerors by British populations, Oisc could present himself as a ruler who understood and respected local traditions while maintaining the military effectiveness that had established Saxon dominance. The religious dimension of Oisc's preparation for leadership created particular challenges given the mixture of pagan and Christian influences in Kent. While maintaining loyalty to the Germanic gods honored by his Saxon followers, Oisc also demonstrated respect for Christian practices and beliefs that would be necessary for effective governance over increasingly Christian British populations. This religious flexibility reflected a pragmatic approach to theological questions that would become characteristic of Anglo-Saxon political leadership. Rather than viewing religious differences as insurmountable barriers to effective governance, Oisc learned to treat them as manageable challenges that could be addressed through careful diplomacy and mutual accommodation. The testing of Oisc's leadership capabilities began long before his formal succession to power, as Hengist gradually delegated increasing responsibilities to his son, while retaining ultimate authority over crucial decisions. This apprenticeship period allowed Oisc to demonstrate his competence while providing opportunities for Saxon nobles and British subjects to become accustomed to his leadership style and political priorities. The military commands that Oisc received during this period provided opportunities to prove his battlefield effectiveness while building personal relationships with Saxon warriors whose loyalty would be crucial for his future authority. His leadership of successful campaigns against British raiders and Irish sea pirates demonstrated both tactical skill and the personal courage that Germanic culture demanded from its leaders. The administrative responsibilities that complemented Oisc's military duties revealed his growing understanding of the economic and political foundations necessary for maintaining Saxon rule over territorial populations. His oversight of taxation collection, judicial proceedings, and diplomatic negotiations provided practical experience in the day-to-day governance that would define his future reign. The gradual assumption of leadership responsibilities by Oisc was carefully orchestrated to minimize potential opposition from Saxon nobles who might have preferred different succession arrangements. Each new responsibility was granted in ways that demonstrated Hengist's confidence in his son, while providing opportunities for potential rivals to observe Oisc's competence and build relationships with the future king. The international recognition that Oisc received from other Saxon leaders and continental Germanic rulers helped establish his legitimacy beyond the boundaries of Kent. Diplomatic exchanges with other emerging Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and with Germanic societies across the North Sea demonstrated that Oisc was viewed as a worthy successor to his father's achievements and political positions. The marriage arrangements that were negotiated for Oisc reflected the sophisticated political calculations that had become necessary for maintaining Saxon power in post-Roman Britain. His marriage to a noble woman whose family possessed both Saxon and British connections would strengthen dynastic legitimacy while building political alliances that could support the kingdom during future crises. The ceremonial aspects of Oisc's gradual elevation to heir apparent demonstrated the evolution of Saxon political culture as it adapted to the requirements of territorial rule. Traditional Germanic rituals involving warrior loyalty and personal oaths were combined with innovations that emphasized territorial sovereignty and administrative authority over settled populations. The legal frameworks that were developed to support Oisc's succession reflected the complex mixture of Germanic custom and Roman administrative practice that characterized Saxon rule in Kent. New precedents were established for the inheritance of territorial authority, while maintaining traditional concepts of personal loyalty and military service that remained central to Saxon political culture. The economic foundations of Oisc's future reign were strengthened through systematic development of Kent's agricultural and commercial resources. The integration of Saxon military protection with British farming expertise created agricultural surpluses that could support larger military forces while generating trade revenues that enhanced the kingdom's economic independence. The military innovations that Oisc implemented during his apprenticeship period reflected his understanding of the changing nature of warfare in post-Roman Britain. The development of more sophisticated tactics and the integration of new military technologies would prove crucial for maintaining Saxon territorial control against increasingly organized British resistance movements. The cultural policies that Oisc developed emphasized the preservation of Saxon identity while allowing for the gradual integration of British customs and traditions that could strengthen rather than threaten Germanic rule. This approach required careful balance between maintaining warrior loyalty and accommodating the expectations of British subjects who formed the majority of the kingdom's population. The educational institutions that were established under Oisc's influence reflected his understanding of the importance of literacy and administrative competence for effective territorial governance. The combination of Germanic military training with Latin education and Roman legal knowledge created a new generation of Saxon leaders capable of sophisticated political and administrative action. The diplomatic relationships that Oisc cultivated with other British kingdoms demonstrated his evolution from simple military commander to strategic political thinker capable of complex international relations. His negotiations with potential allies and enemies revealed sophisticated understanding of the broader political dynamics affecting post-Roman Britain. The succession of Oisc to active leadership following Hengist's eventual death would mark the successful transition from the first generation of Saxon conquerors to a new generation of Anglo-Saxon rulers who combined Germanic military traditions with the administrative and political skills necessary for territorial governance. This transition would establish patterns that would influence Anglo-Saxon political development throughout Britain for centuries to come. The legacy of Oisc's rise to power extended far beyond Kent to influence the development of other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms throughout Britain. His successful combination of Germanic identity with British political sophistication provided a model that would be emulated by other Saxon leaders while establishing dynastic precedents that would shape medieval English kingship. The transformation of Saxon warbands into territorial kingdoms represented one of the most significant political developments of the post-Roman period, and Oisc's preparation for leadership embodied the cultural and institutional changes that made this transformation possible. His eventual reign would demonstrate that barbarian successor states could evolve into sophisticated political entities capable of effective governance over diverse populations. The years following the Battle of Aylesford marked a crucial period in the development of Saxon Kent, as Hengist and his successors worked to transform their military conquest into lasting political control over the territory and populations they had won through force of arms. This process of consolidation required not only continued military vigilance, but also the development of sophisticated governmental institutions that could integrate Saxon leadership with British administrative traditions while maintaining the cultural identity that justified Germanic rule. The establishment of effective territorial control throughout Kent required systematic attention to both the geographic and demographic challenges that characterized post-Roman British society. The kingdom's boundaries were not simply lines on a map, but complex zones of interaction where Saxon authority had to be demonstrated through both military presence and administrative competence. The successful integration of these border regions would determine whether Hengist's realm could achieve the stability necessary for long-term survival. The population of Kent during this period included not only the original British inhabitants and Saxon settlers, but also increasing numbers of individuals whose origins and loyalties were more complex. Intermarriage between Saxon and British families had created a generation of children who combined Germanic and Celtic heritage, while refugees from other parts of Britain brought their own cultural traditions and political expectations to the emerging kingdom. The legal frameworks that evolved to govern this diverse population reflected Hengist's understanding that effective rule required accommodation of different customs and traditions rather than simple imposition of Saxon practices. The resulting legal system combined Germanic concepts of personal honour and direct action with British traditions of written law and administrative procedure, creating hybrid institutions that could address the practical needs of territorial governance. The judicial processes that emerged from this legal synthesis required trained administrators who could navigate the complexities of mixed legal traditions while maintaining the authority of Saxon political leadership. The development of a professional class of legal scholars and administrative officials represented one of the most significant innovations of Hengist's reign, establishing institutional foundations that would support Anglo-Saxon governance for centuries. The economic policies implemented during this consolidation period focused on maximizing the productive capacity of Kent's agricultural and commercial resources, while ensuring that economic development served the broader political objectives of Saxon rule. The integration of Saxon military protection with British farming expertise created agricultural systems that could support larger populations while generating the surpluses necessary for military expansion and territorial defence. The trade relationships that were established with other Saxon settlements and continental Germanic societies provided crucial support for Kent's economic development, while maintaining cultural connections that reinforced Saxon identity. The importation of specialized craftsmen, luxury goods, and military supplies helped establish Canterbury as a major commercial centre that rivaled the greatest cities of post-Roman Europe. The commercial networks that extended from Saxon Kent throughout Britain and across the North Sea to continental Europe demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of economic relationships that characterized Hengist's approach to governance. These trade connections provided not only material benefits, but also intelligence networks that kept Saxon leadership informed about political developments that might affect their kingdom's security and prosperity. The military reforms that were implemented during this period reflected lessons learned from the Battle of Aylesford and subsequent conflicts with British resistance movements. The development of more sophisticated tactical doctrines and the integration of new military technologies allowed Saxon forces to maintain their battlefield superiority while adapting to changing strategic circumstances. The fortification programs that were undertaken throughout Kent created a defensive network that could protect both military installations and civilian populations, while providing bases for offensive operations against external enemies. These fortifications were designed according to Germanic principles that emphasized tactical flexibility and rapid response rather than the massive static defenses that had characterized Roman military engineering. The recruitment and training of military forces became increasingly systematic as Saxon leadership recognized the need for larger and more specialized armies to maintain territorial control and defend against coordinated enemy attacks. The establishment of military academies and training centers ensured that Saxon tactical advantages would be preserved and enhanced as the kingdom expanded its territorial control. The diplomatic initiatives that Hengist pursued during this period demonstrated his evolution from simple military commander to sophisticated political strategist capable of complex international relations. The cultivation of alliances with other Saxon leaders and the negotiation of agreements with British kingdoms required diplomatic skills that went far beyond traditional Germanic approaches to intertribal relations. The marriage alliances that were arranged between Saxon and British noble families served both political and cultural purposes, creating bonds of kinship that could transcend ethnic boundaries, while demonstrating Saxon commitment to permanent settlement rather than temporary conquest. These marriages also provided opportunities for cultural exchange that enriched both Saxon and British traditions. The religious policies that were developed during this consolidation period required careful balance between maintaining Saxon cultural identity and accommodating the Christian beliefs of British subjects. The gradual conversion of some Saxon nobles to Christianity created opportunities for religious bridge building, while raising questions about the preservation of traditional Germanic spiritual practices. The construction of religious buildings that could serve both Christian and pagan communities demonstrated the pragmatic approach to theological questions that characterized Saxon rule in Kent. The adaptation of existing British churches for Saxon use and the construction of new religious centres that incorporated both Christian and Germanic elements reflected sophisticated understanding of the role that religion played in political legitimacy. The educational institutions that were established during this period focused on creating a new generation of leaders who could combine Saxon military traditions with the administrative and cultural skills necessary for effective territorial governance. The curriculum that evolved in these schools included Germanic military training, Latin literacy, Christian theology, and Roman legal traditions, creating uniquely Anglo-Saxon approaches to leadership preparation. The cultural developments that occurred during the Consolidation period reflected the creative synthesis of Germanic and British traditions that was becoming characteristic of Saxon civilization in Britain. The emergence of distinctively Anglo-Saxon artistic styles, literary traditions, and ceremonial practices demonstrated that cultural fusion could strengthen rather than weaken Saxon identity. The architectural innovations that appeared in Saxon Kent during this period combined Germanic building techniques with Roman engineering principles and British decorative traditions. The great halls that were constructed for Saxon nobles incorporated the best elements of all three cultural traditions while creating distinctively Anglo-Saxon architectural styles that would influence building design throughout medieval England. The literary traditions that developed in Saxon Kent reflected the preservation of Germanic heroic poetry, combined with the adoption of Latin literacy and Christian theological themes. The emergence of written Anglo-Saxon literature represented one of the most significant cultural achievements of this period, creating literary traditions that would influence English culture for centuries. The administrative innovations that were implemented during the Consolidation period created governmental institutions that could effectively manage the complex tasks of territorial rule, while maintaining the personal relationships that remained central to Saxon political culture. The development of written records, systematic taxation, and professional bureaucracies represented major advances in governmental sophistication. The territorial expansion that occurred during this period demonstrated Saxon confidence in their ability to maintain control over larger areas while integrating new populations into their governmental systems. The gradual extension of Saxon authority throughout southeastern England required both military conquest and the political skills necessary to transform defeated enemies into loyal subjects. The resistance movements that emerged in response to Saxon expansion tested the effectiveness of the governmental institutions that had been developed during the Consolidation period. The ability of Saxon administration to maintain territorial control while facing coordinated opposition demonstrated the success of Hengist's policies in creating stable and effective governance. The intelligence networks that were established throughout Britain and continental Europe provided Saxon leadership with the information necessary for effective strategic planning while maintaining security against potential threats. The development of systematic intelligence gathering represented one of the most sophisticated aspects of Saxon governmental organization. The technological innovations that were encouraged during this period enhanced Saxon military capabilities while contributing to economic development and cultural advancement. The improvement of weapons manufacturing, agricultural techniques, and construction methods demonstrated the benefits of cultural synthesis between Germanic and British traditions. The succession planning that was undertaken during the later years of Hengist's reign ensured that the governmental institutions and political relationships that had been developed could survive the transition to new leadership. The careful preparation of Oisc for eventual succession demonstrated the evolution of Saxon political culture from warband leadership to dynastic monarchy. The international recognition that Saxon Kent received during this period established the kingdom as a major player in post-Roman European politics, while providing security against potential enemies who might have challenged a more isolated Saxon state. The diplomatic relationships that were cultivated with other barbarian kingdoms and surviving Roman territories demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of international relations that characterized Saxon leadership. The legal precedents that were established during the Consolidation period created frameworks for governance that would influence Anglo-Saxon political development throughout Britain. The successful integration of Germanic and British legal traditions provided models that could be adapted to different circumstances while maintaining the essential characteristics that made Saxon rule effective. The economic prosperity that was achieved during this period demonstrated the success of Saxon policies in creating stable and productive governmental institutions. The growth of trade, agriculture, and craft production provided the material foundation necessary for military expansion, while creating standards of living that attracted additional settlers and supported population growth. The cultural achievements of this period established Saxon Kent as a centre of learning and artistic production that rivaled the greatest centres of post-Roman European civilization. The synthesis of Germanic, British, and continental influences created distinctive Anglo-Saxon cultural traditions that would influence European development for centuries. The military successes that were achieved during the Consolidation period demonstrated the effectiveness of Saxon tactical innovations and organizational reforms. The ability to maintain territorial control while facing coordinated opposition from multiple enemies established Saxon military reputation throughout Europe, while providing security for continued political and economic development. As the Consolidation period drew to its close, Saxon Kent had been transformed from a simple military occupation into a sophisticated territorial kingdom that combined the best elements of Germanic, British, and Roman political traditions. This achievement represented not only a personal triumph for Hengist, but also a successful model for the establishment of barbarian successor states that would be emulated throughout former Roman territories in Western Europe. The transformation of Hengist from wandering mercenary to founding monarch of the Kingdom of Kent represented far more than a simple tale of individual ambition and achievement. His legacy would extend across centuries of English history, establishing patterns of governance, cultural synthesis, and political development that would influence the formation of medieval England and shape the character of Anglo-Saxon civilization for generations to come. The dynastic precedents that were established through Hengist's reign and the succession of his son Oisc created the foundation for hereditary monarchy that would become characteristic of Anglo-Saxon political organization throughout Britain. The concept of royal blood and dynastic legitimacy that emerged from the Kentish experience would be adopted and adapted by other Germanic leaders as they established their own kingdoms in former Roman territories. The governmental institutions that were developed in Saxon Kent provided practical models for territorial administration that combined Germanic military leadership with the bureaucratic sophistication necessary for governing settled populations. The synthesis of personal loyalty relationships with systematic administrative procedures created uniquely Anglo-Saxon approaches to governance that would influence political development throughout medieval Europe. The cultural achievements of Hengist's reign demonstrated that barbarian conquest could lead to cultural enrichment rather than simple destruction of existing civilizations. The creative fusion of Germanic, British, and Roman traditions that occurred in Kent established patterns of cultural synthesis that would characterize Anglo-Saxon development throughout the early medieval period. The military innovations that were pioneered in Saxon Kent influenced tactical development throughout Germanic Europe, while establishing Anglo-Saxon military reputation that would endure for centuries. The combination of traditional Germanic warrior culture with tactical sophistication and strategic thinking created military traditions that would prove crucial for Anglo-Saxon survival and expansion. The religious evolution that occurred during Hengist's reign provided important precedents for the eventual conversion of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Christianity, while maintaining essential elements of Germanic cultural identity. The pragmatic approach to theological questions that characterized Saxon policy in Kent would influence religious development throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The economic policies that were implemented in Kent demonstrated the potential for barbarian kingdoms to achieve prosperity through systematic development of agricultural and commercial resources. The success of Saxon economic management provided inspiration and practical guidance for other Germanic leaders while establishing Kent as a major commercial centre in post-Roman Europe. The diplomatic relationships that were cultivated during Hengist's reign established Saxon Kent as a significant player in early medieval international relations, while providing security and support for continued territorial expansion. The sophisticated understanding of diplomatic strategy that characterized Saxon foreign policy would influence Anglo-Saxon international relations for centuries. The legal traditions that emerged from the synthesis of Germanic and British customs created frameworks for justice and governance that would influence Anglo-Saxon law throughout the medieval period. The precedents that were established in Kent for integrating different legal traditions provided models that could be adapted to various circumstances throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The architectural innovations that appeared in Saxon Kent established distinctive Anglo-Saxon building traditions that would influence construction throughout medieval England. The great halls and fortifications that were constructed during Hengist's reign demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both defensive requirements and ceremonial needs. The literary traditions that began to develop in Kent created the foundation for Anglo-Saxon literature that would produce some of the greatest works of medieval European culture. The preservation of Germanic heroic poetry, combined with the adoption of Latin literacy, established cultural patterns that would culminate in masterpieces like Beowulf and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The educational institutions that were established in Kent provided models for learning and cultural development that would be copied throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The curriculum that combined Germanic military training with Latin scholarship and Christian theology created uniquely Anglo-Saxon approaches to education that would influence medieval intellectual development. The territorial expansion that began in Kent provided the model for Anglo-Saxon conquest and settlement throughout Britain. The methods that were developed for conquering and integrating new territories would be employed by successive generations of Anglo-Saxon leaders as they extended Germanic control throughout England. The administrative innovations that were pioneered in Kent created governmental institutions that could effectively manage the complex tasks of territorial rule, while maintaining the personal relationships that remained central to Germanic political culture. These innovations would prove crucial for the development of effective Anglo-Saxon kingdoms throughout Britain. The commercial networks that were established from Kent provided the foundation for Anglo-Saxon participation in international trade that would enhance the prosperity and cultural development of Germanic kingdoms throughout Britain. The trading relationships that were cultivated with continental Europe and other parts of Britain would prove crucial for Anglo-Saxon economic development. The military traditions that were established in Kent would influence Anglo-Saxon warfare for centuries, providing tactical doctrines and organizational models that would be employed in countless battles throughout the medieval period. The reputation for military effectiveness that was established in Kent would become a defining characteristic of Anglo-Saxon culture. The cultural synthesis that occurred in Kent provided the foundation for distinctive Anglo-Saxon civilization that would influence European development throughout the medieval period. The creative combination of Germanic, British and Roman traditions established cultural patterns that would characterize English civilization for centuries. The political precedents that were established in Kent influenced the development of monarchy and governance throughout medieval Europe. The successful transformation of Germanic warband leadership into territorial kingship provided models that would be emulated by other barbarian successors to Roman authority. The technological innovations that were encouraged in Kent contributed to agricultural, military, and cultural development that would benefit Anglo-Saxon civilization for generations. The improvements in weapons manufacturing, construction techniques, and agricultural methods demonstrated the benefits of cultural exchange and technological adaptation. The international reputation that Saxon Kent achieved during Hengist's reign established Anglo-Saxon civilization as a major force in early medieval European politics. The respect and recognition that were accorded to Saxon achievements would influence international relations throughout the medieval period. The demographic changes that occurred in Kent during Hengist's reign established patterns of settlement and population integration that would characterize Anglo-Saxon expansion throughout Britain. The successful integration of Germanic settlers with existing British populations provided models that would be employed throughout the Anglo-Saxon conquest. The linguistic developments that began in Kent contributed to the evolution of Old English that would become the foundation for medieval English literature and culture. The synthesis of Germanic languages with British Celtic and Latin influences created linguistic innovations that would characterize English language development. The religious precedents that were established in Kent influenced the eventual conversion of Anglo-Saxon England to Christianity, while maintaining important elements of Germanic cultural identity. The patterns of religious accommodation and synthesis that were developed would prove crucial for the successful Christianization of Anglo-Saxon society. The artistic traditions that emerged in Kent established distinctive Anglo-Saxon styles that would influence European art throughout the medieval period. The creative fusion of Germanic, British, and continental artistic traditions created uniquely Anglo-Saxon aesthetic approaches that would characterize English art for centuries. The social innovations that were implemented in Kent provided models for integrating diverse populations into unified political entities while maintaining cultural diversity and respect for different traditions. These social policies would prove crucial for the successful development of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms throughout Britain. The historical significance of Hengist's achievements extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of 5th century Kent to influence the entire course of English and European history. The kingdom that he established would serve as the foundation for Anglo-Saxon England, while the methods he developed for conquest and governance would provide models for medieval political development throughout Europe. The legendary status that Hengist achieved in Anglo-Saxon culture would inspire countless generations of warriors and leaders, while providing cultural narratives that would strengthen Anglo-Saxon identity throughout the medieval period. The stories of his achievements would become central elements of English folklore and historical tradition. The practical achievements of Hengist's reign demonstrated that the collapse of Roman authority did not necessarily lead to political chaos and cultural decline. His success in creating stable and prosperous governance provided hope and inspiration for other leaders who sought to build new political entities from the ruins of the ancient world. The enduring influence of Hengist's legacy can be traced throughout subsequent English history, from the medieval development of parliamentary government to the modern evolution of constitutional monarchy. The precedents that he established for balancing personal leadership with institutional governance would prove crucial for the long-term development of English political culture. As we reflect on the remarkable transformation that Hengist achieved from mercenary adventurer to founding monarch, we can appreciate not only his individual accomplishments, but also his role in the broader historical process that created medieval England. His legacy represents the successful fusion of Germanic vigour with British sophistication that would characterize English civilization throughout its subsequent development. The kingdom that Hengist built in Kent would endure for centuries, providing stability and prosperity for its inhabitants, while serving as a model for political development throughout Anglo-Saxon England. His achievement in creating lasting institutions from temporary military success demonstrated the potential for creative political leadership to shape the course of history. The influence of Hengist's legacy extends beyond political and military achievements to encompass the cultural and intellectual developments that would characterize Anglo-Saxon civilization. His support for learning, artistic expression, and cultural synthesis established patterns that would produce some of the greatest achievements of medieval European culture. The historical importance of Hengist's reign lies not only in its immediate achievements, but also in its demonstration that historical transformation could occur through creative adaptation rather than simple destruction. His success in building bridges between different cultures and traditions provided models for peaceful development that would influence European history for centuries. As the soft light of dawn breaks over the misty marshlands of Kent, we reach the end of our peaceful journey through the life and achievements of Hengist, the Saxon warrior who would become the founder of a kingdom and the architect of a new age in British history. His story, woven from threads of legend and history, represents one of the most remarkable transformations in all of medieval Europe: the evolution of a Germanic mercenary into the founding father of Anglo-Saxon England. The tale we have followed together through these quiet hours reveals far more than the adventures of a single individual, however extraordinary those adventures may have been. In Hengist's rise from hired sword to territorial king, we witness the broader transformation of post-Roman Britain from a fragmented collection of competing territories into the foundation of what would become medieval England. The world that Hengist entered when his ships first touched the shores of Thanet was one of uncertainty and opportunity. The withdrawal of Roman legions had left a power vacuum that local strongmen struggled to fill, while external enemies pressed against every frontier. Into this chaos came Germanic warriors whose military effectiveness and cultural adaptability would prove decisive in shaping Britain's future. The methods that Hengist employed to transform military success into political authority demonstrate the sophisticated understanding of governance that would characterize the best Anglo-Saxon leaders. His ability to combine Germanic military traditions with British administrative expertise created governmental institutions that could effectively rule diverse populations while maintaining cultural identity and military effectiveness. The cultural synthesis that occurred in Saxon Kent under Hengist's leadership established patterns that would influence English civilization for centuries. The creative fusion of Germanic, British, and Roman traditions produced uniquely Anglo-Saxon approaches to art, literature, law, and governance that would shape medieval European development. The military innovations that were pioneered in Kent provided tactical and organizational models that would be employed throughout the Anglo-Saxon conquest of Britain. The reputation for effectiveness that Saxon forces established under Hengist's leadership would become a defining characteristic of Germanic military culture throughout the medieval period. The economic policies that were implemented in Kent demonstrated the potential for barbarian kingdoms to achieve prosperity through systematic development of agricultural and commercial resources. The success of Saxon economic management provided inspiration and practical guidance for other Germanic leaders, while establishing patterns of development that would characterize Anglo-Saxon England. The religious evolution that occurred during Hengist's reign provided important precedents for the eventual conversion of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Christianity. The pragmatic approach to theological questions that characterized Saxon policy created frameworks for religious accommodation that would prove crucial for the successful Christianization of Germanic society. The diplomatic relationships that were cultivated during this period established Anglo-Saxon kingdoms as significant players in early medieval international relations. The sophisticated understanding of diplomatic strategy that characterized Saxon foreign policy would influence European political development throughout the medieval period. The legal traditions that emerged from the synthesis of Germanic and British customs created frameworks for justice and governance that would influence Anglo-Saxon law for generations. The precedents that were established for integrating different legal traditions provided models that could be adapted to various circumstances throughout medieval England. The territorial expansion that began in Kent provided the foundation for Anglo-Saxon control throughout Britain. The methods that were developed for conquering and integrating new territories would be employed by successive generations of Germanic leaders as they extended their authority throughout England. The dynastic precedents that were established through Hengist's reign created the foundation for hereditary monarchy that would become characteristic of Anglo-Saxon political organization. The concept of royal legitimacy that emerged from the Kentish experience would influence political development throughout medieval Europe. The architectural innovations that appeared in Saxon Kent established distinctive building traditions that would influence construction throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The great halls and fortifications that were constructed demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both defensive requirements and ceremonial needs. The educational institutions that were established provided models for learning and cultural development that would be copied throughout Germanic kingdoms. The curriculum that combined military training with scholarly pursuits created uniquely Anglo-Saxon approaches to education that would influence medieval intellectual development. The technological innovations that were encouraged contributed to agricultural, military, and cultural development that would benefit Anglo-Saxon civilization for generations. The improvements in manufacturing techniques and agricultural methods demonstrated the benefits of cultural exchange and adaptation. The social innovations that were implemented provided models for integrating diverse populations into unified political entities while maintaining cultural diversity. These social policies would prove crucial for the successful development of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms throughout Britain. The historical significance of Hengist's achievements extends far beyond the immediate circumstances of 5th century Kent to influence the entire course of English history. The kingdom that he established would serve as the foundation for Anglo-Saxon England, while the methods he developed would provide models for medieval political development. The legendary status that Hengist achieved in Anglo-Saxon culture would inspire countless generations while providing cultural narratives that would strengthen English identity throughout the medieval period. His story would become a central element of English historical tradition and folklore. The enduring influence of Hengist's legacy can be traced throughout subsequent English development, from medieval parliamentary government to modern constitutional monarchy. The precedents that he established for balancing personal leadership with institutional governance would prove crucial for English political evolution. As we conclude our gentle exploration of this remarkable period in history, we can appreciate how the seeds planted in 5th century Kent would grow into the mighty oak of Anglo-Saxon civilization. The kingdom that Hengist founded would endure for centuries, providing stability and prosperity, while serving as a beacon of successful cultural synthesis and political innovation. The transformation that Hengist achieved from wandering warrior to founding monarch represents one of history's most successful examples of adaptive leadership and creative political development. His ability to combine military effectiveness with governmental sophistication created lasting institutions that would influence European civilization for centuries. The cultural achievements that were fostered during his reign established foundations for Anglo-Saxon learning and artistic expression that would produce some of medieval Europe's greatest contributions to human culture. The support for cultural synthesis and intellectual development created traditions that would characterize English civilization throughout its subsequent evolution. The practical wisdom that guided Hengist's policies demonstrated that political success required not only military prowess, but also understanding of economics, diplomacy, law, and cultural accommodation. His comprehensive approach to governance provided models for effective leadership that would influence political development throughout medieval Europe. The international reputation that Saxon Kent achieved established Anglo-Saxon civilization as a major force in early medieval politics. The respect and recognition accorded to Saxon achievements would influence European relations throughout the medieval period, while providing security for continued development. The demographic and linguistic changes that occurred in Kent during Hengist's reign established patterns that would characterize Anglo-Saxon expansion throughout Britain. The successful integration of different populations created models for peaceful development that would benefit English society for generations. As the morning light grows stronger and our peaceful journey through the mists of early English history draws to its close, we can rest assured that the legacy of Hengist and his fellow pioneers continues to influence our world today. The institutions they created, the traditions they established, and the examples they set would echo through centuries of English development, contributing to the formation of the democratic traditions and cultural achievements that characterize modern English-speaking civilization. The Kingdom of Kent that emerged from Hengist's vision and determination would serve not only as the foundation for Anglo-Saxon England, but also as a testament to the power of adaptive leadership and cultural synthesis to create lasting institutions from temporary opportunities. His achievement reminds us that history is shaped not only by great forces and inevitable trends, but also by individuals who possess the vision and determination to transform their circumstances through creative action. In the quiet moments before sleep claims us, we can reflect on the remarkable journey we have shared, from the grey waters of the North Sea to the green hills of Kent, from the chaos of post-Roman Britain to the ordered prosperity of the first Anglo-Saxon kingdom. The story of Hengist and the founding of Kent represents not only a fascinating chapter in medieval history, but also an inspiring example of how individual courage and wisdom can shape the destiny of nations and cultures. May your dreams be filled with the gentle sounds of this ancient world, the lapping of waves against Saxon ships, the whisper of wind through Kentish meadows, and the soft voices of our ancestors as they built the foundations of the civilization we inherit today. Sleep well, dear listener, and remember that every dawn brings new opportunities for transformation and achievement, just as it did for Hengist and his followers in those distant days when England was young. The kingdom they built in Kent would stand as testament to the power of vision, courage, and wisdom to create lasting achievements from temporary opportunities. Their legacy lives on in the traditions, institutions, and cultural patterns that continue to shape our world, reminding us that we too are participants in the great story of human development and achievement. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me on this peaceful journey through the dawn of Anglo-Saxon England, where history and legend meet in the misty borderlands between sleeping and waking, between past and present, between the world that was and the world that would be. Thank you for listening to Sleepy Crown. If you enjoyed this peaceful journey through the life of Hengist and the founding of Kent, please like this video and subscribe for more soothing historical tales. I'd love to hear in the comments which Anglo-Saxon kingdom you'd like to explore next, or share what you found most fascinating about these early English origins. Until next time, sleep peacefully